Good morning to you all. Excellencies, dear colleagues, distinguished participants, it is an honor for me to welcome all of you today to the Maltese House of Representatives to discuss a very important topic. First of all, I want to welcome in particular our guest, Dr. Lidia Bela, spouse of the Maltese Prime Minister, from the Council of Europe, and Ms. Iris Luarazi, President of Grevio. Did I spell it okay? Mr. Roberto Olla, Head of the Department for Human Dignity and Gender Equality, as well as the Maltese EU Commissioner for Equality, Anna Dalli, for participating in this conference. As you know, we gathered here today to discuss ways forward on how to confront, fight, and eliminate one of the most widespread human rights violations worldwide. Violence against women is a threat to a safe and peaceful society. It is the cause of pain and suffering among families and communities at large, fueling gender inequalities and harmful stereotypes. No country is immune to such challenges, and of course Malta is no exception. The horrific murders of Polina Dembska, Rita Lul, and Bernice Celia last year are a powerful reminder for all of us of the urgent need to keep this issue high on the agenda. No woman shall live in fear for her life. It is our duty to be the voice of those who cannot speak for themselves and listen to those victims who are calling for help. Silence is not an option. We cannot remain complacent. It is a sense of urgency that drove Council of Europe member states to draft and later adopt one of the most groundbreaking international conventions on the protection from women from violence. Opened for signature almost 12 years ago, the Council of Europe Convention on Action Against Gender-Based Violence and Domestic Violence, as you know, known as the Istanbul Convention, has become the primary framework which states can look up to in their policies and also initiatives in fighting violence against women. Taking Malta as an example, the signature and ratification of the Istanbul Convention played a key role in the development of various legislations that followed. Malta, for example, ratified the Istanbul Convention way back in July 2014. The ratification eventually led to an act of parliament that was in 2018, which integrated and implemented the provisions of the Istanbul Convention into national law in order to ensure that victims of violence were afforded sufficient protection. Only last June, our parliament continued its commitment through the introduction now of femicide in our criminal code, an amendment which propels the court to consider femicide as a factor against leniency in punishment once a person is declared guilty of homicide. However, the fight is far from over. More needs to be done to truly eradicate violence against women. This is a fight that requires commitment from everyone, that is from the lawmakers at the highest level to the individual citizens. It should also not be a fight fought by women and girls alone. Men and boys also have an important role to play in this battle, hence the choice of today's theme for the conference. As rightly stated in a recent resolution of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, men can be, and I quote, agents of change by speaking out against harmful practices, acting as role models, and challenging sexism, close quote. This requires the need to counter the patriarchal norms and the harmful concept of strong masculinity, which are unfortunately still present in our society. Through today's conference, we'll be delving into the impact and harmful gender stereotypes, ways how to address and eliminate them in order to effectively prevent and combat violence against women, and how men and boys contribute more actively in this respect. We will also look in the concept of intersectionality in the context of violence against women and how to what extent an intersectional approach is beneficial in addressing violence against women in a holistic manner. We must remember that women are not one large group of people. There are women who form part of a minority, women who have disabilities, or who struggle with mental illness. These women can be susceptible to gender violence, whether it is physical or take other forms. As stated in the Istanbul Convention, which I referred to earlier in my speech, we are under the obligation to take measures to prevent and combat violence against all women, irrespective of their race, color, language, religion, and disability, among others. In conclusion, I once again welcome you to this conference, welcome you to Malta, and I look forward to hearing what our experts have to say. However, I'm certain that we have a lot to learn, both from our excellent panelists and from other experiences. Thank you very much. Now, before we move on to today's discussion, may I ask the participants that microphones are only to be used by pressing, you've got the speak button, when it is your time, of course, to take the floor, as indicated by the moderator. And those of you taking the floor are requested to stand up when speaking. You are kindly requested also not to exceed the allocated speaking time. Everybody knows his speaking time. And there will be the green light over there that you have 30 seconds left to your remarks. And the red light, when it flashes, will mean that the allocated time has expired. Now I pass to the keynote speakers, and I give the floor to you, Dr. Lidia Bela. I welcome you. Dr. Lidia Bela is a lawyer and spouse of the Honorable Prime Minister, for your remarks. Thank you.
Mr. President, Dr. Angelou Farrugia, Dr. Elena Dalli, Ms. Iris Louarasi, members of Parliament, distinguished guests, good morning. Violence against women is not just a women's issue. It is a societal scourge that needs to be recognized and addressed by society at large, regardless of gender. Such violence can also take many forms. It includes, amongst others, rape, female genital mutilation, honor killings, sexual harassment, and forced marriage. Yet, the most widespread form is that of intimate partner violence. Regrettably, the COVID-19 pandemic exacerbated violence against women, especially intimate partner violence, with a spike in domestic violence cases in 2021. We have also witnessed, most tragically, lethal forms of violence against women in recent months and years. This must not, and most certainly will not, be overlooked. Our country is committed to address this scourge and deliver a better and safer future for our women and girls. And men and boys will play a pivotal role in this. Because it is in our homes, the way we talk to one another, and our everyday lives, that we either choose to accept certain behaviors or stand up to them. When we are talking of men and boys, we are not talking about all men and boys as being perpetrators. Yet, we must be mindful of the data that shows that men and boys are the predominant perpetrators, while women, in general, are the predominant victims. I do believe that the patriarchy and traditional gender norms are a root cause of such violence. Harmful prejudices and gender stereotypes that have for years contributed to making such violence acceptable. We absolutely must do all we can to break these norms. The introduction of femicide law in the criminal code attests to our commitment to combat domestic violence, whilst a new law debated quite recently will allow checks to be carried out on the partners passed vis-à-vis domestic violence. These are crucial steps forward in our efforts to address domestic violence. Moreover, Malta was recently amongst the 38 signatories to the Dublin Declaration on the Prevention of Domestic, Sexual and Gender-Based Violence that was adopted on 30th of September 2022, which, amongst others, underlined the specific role of men and boys in preventing violence against women. Malta ratified the Istanbul Convention in 2014, and it entered into force that same year. It is the first and most comprehensive international binding treaty that addresses gender-based violence as violence that affects women disproportionately. The Istanbul Convention has been instrumental in raising awareness and improving national legislation, but it also brought to the fore the different forms of gender-based violence which exist in Europe. These forms of violence are mostly perpetrated by men against women due to unequal power relations between these two genders. And this is why the eradication of violence against women is imperative to achieving gender equality. As Malta sits on the United Nations Security Council, advancing women, particularly in peace and security, is one of our key priorities on a multilateral basis. Ladies and gentlemen, combating violence against women must be a joint effort. Each and every one of us must contribute in our own way, no matter how small we are. Men and boys, as I mentioned earlier, play a crucial role in this process and are key to breaking the norms and stereotypes in this generation and for those of the future. Violence against women is not acceptable, and I am confident that if we work together to raise awareness at all levels, we can address the scourge to our society such that women and girls will not be exposed to this abuse and pain. Together, we can win. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Abela. Now I give the floor to Dr. Elena Dalli, who is the EU Commissioner for Equality. The floor is yours.
It's very good to be back in this room. I feel very much at home here. Dr. Abela, dear parliamentary secretaries, dear opposition spokesperson for equality, dear parliamentarians, Ms. Louarazi, dear friends. Throughout my political mandates and responsibilities, combating violence against women and domestic violence has always been a priority. And the more I work in this area of policy, the more I realize how much more needs to be done every day. Doing this at the highest European level is an opportunity to cooperate with stakeholders across Europe and international organizations for greater impact and in making a difference for all women in Europe. Life stories and numerous studies, amongst which the Council of Europe, continue to confirm the magnitude of violence against women and children and the difference in national responses across Europe. The Council of Europe recognizes that to end this phenomenon, one must address its different layers: the prevention, the protection, the prosecution. The need for countries to work individually to achieve national progress, but also to act collectively to achieve progress as a continent. The Istanbul Convention and the work of the Council of Europe set the bar high in terms of legal obligations on its signatories. After ratifying the Convention in 2014, Malta brought its legal framework on gender-based violence and domestic violence in line with the Convention. Malta is also one of the few countries, as we have already heard from Dr. Abela, that changed its legislation and removed violence as a requirement, its illegal provisions against femicide in its criminal code, with harsher penalties for gender-motivated murder since last year. In 2014, Sweden, after ratifying the convention, changed its legislation and removed violence as a requirement for the prosecution to prove a case of rape, but rather to base it on the lack of explicit consent. So conviction rates went up to 75% in the first year. Also, at EU level, I am happy to announce that positive developments are finally taking place after years of stalemate for the EU's accession to the Istanbul Convention to be formalized in June. The EU wants to live up to its international obligations. This is why the European Commission proposed a legal framework with minimum standards for all member states to criminalize the most serious forms of violence, including in particular by ensuring an EU-wide definition of rape as sex without consent. An understanding that sex without consent is rape is the first step to change social attitudes that further harm rape victims. And we have a long way to go here. For instance, there are still legal professionals who ask a sexual assault victim, what was she wearing when she was assaulted? I had launched an exhibition in November 2021 at the Commission headquarters, exactly with the title, What Were You Wearing That Day?, to raise awareness about the reality that this is a question we continue to hear in our courtrooms. And to get back to EU legislation, we are also proposing the criminalization of online violence targeting women and girls. We have seen an increase in prevalence in the past years, and we need an EU-wide framework to address this scourge. The proposal also aims to enhance victims' access to justice and to set up structures to protect and support victims better. And we want to further train people who are likely to work with victims of gender-based violence, and this will ensure this type of violence can be more easily detected and that victims receive adequate support. Women alone cannot achieve the change we must see, of course. Men and boys have an essential role in ending gender-based violence. Life experiences and analysis of violence will tell you that the vast majority of violence is committed by men, and while men are more likely to be victims of violent crime, women are overwhelmingly more likely to be victims of severe domestic abuse. Research shows that the way boys are socialized, their contact with gender stereotypes, are ingrained patriarchal notions of how society should be governed, and these are likely explanations. Also, it is important that intersectionality is addressed through education. When discrimination on other grounds, such as ethnicity, race, religion, disability, age, or sexual orientation intersect with gender discrimination, violence is often exacerbated. As we educate our boys, the role of men is to challenge today's status quo. So I thank the Council of Europe for the work done on fighting violence against women and girls, and I thank the researchers for organizing the exchange of best practices and involving men and boys in this debate, and I thank you all for being here. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Dalli, for your remarks. Now I welcome Mrs. Iris Lauzari, who is the President of the Council of Europe Group of Experts on Action Against Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence. You've got the floor.
Thank you so much. I would like to thank the Ministry of Foreign European Affairs and Trade for organizing this conference in collaboration with the Parliament of Malta, and for inviting me to deliver a speech alongside with Dr. Lidia Abela and also with Dr. Helena Dalli. none of the least in the view of the forthcoming ratification, as you already announced, of the Istanbul Convention by the European Union. I represent the Council of Europe group of experts on action against violence against women and domestic violence, that it is already known as GREVIO, where I have been a member for the last 8 years, and which I chair for the last 2 years, following in the steps of the former president, Madame Marceline Naudé. GREVIO monitors the implementation of the Council of Europe Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence, better known as the Istanbul Convention. So far, we have published 29 evaluation reports, and we are approaching the end of our monitoring cycle, the first monitoring cycle, while we will evaluate 37 state parties of the Convention. And as you already mentioned, GREVIO report on Malta was published in November 2020. I'm here today actually to raise a few issues as regards to the role of men and boys in combating violence against women, which I'm sure we will gonna take further in the two panels afterwards. The objective of the Istanbul Convention is to prevent and combat gender-based violence against women and girls, keeping them safe so they can enjoy the right to live free from violence. This mostly means preventing and combating male violence against women. But the Istanbul Convention also gives men and boys a strong role, as it was mentioned from Dr. Farrugia in his opening remarks, the role of agents of change. The Convention includes obligation for state parties to prevent violence against women, including by promoting changes in the social cultural patterns of behavior of women and men. The Istanbul Convention called for all members, especially men and boys, to contribute actively to preventing all forms of violence against women. Men can lead by example and should be key partners in preventing violence against women. Putting it simply, combating male violence against women cannot happen without the involvement of men and boys. In our first general recommendation, number 1, which relates to the digital dimension of violence against women that we adopted in October 2021, GREVIO draws attention to the need to acknowledge violence against women in its digital dimension as a continuum of violence against women offline. GREVIO has called on all state parties to recognize the gender nature of violence against women and the abuse perpetrated online and through technology, which requires a holistic approach. The recommendations of GREVIO include the need to encourage men and boys to abandon harmful stereotypes of women and men and to adopt respectfully and healthy behaviors in the digital sphere. In GREVIO, we are noting some initiatives that go in this direction, but unfortunately not yet on a large scale. GREVIO has found that awareness-raising activities, one of the main forms of preventive action, tend to focus more on the victimization of women and girls rather than to the attitudes and social norms that can lead to such violence. In addition, most of the awareness-raising activities and initiatives focus on domestic violence, with very few initiatives addressing the prevention of other prevalent forms of gender-based violence against women, such as rape, sexual harassment, and other forms of violence. Another important aim of the Convention is to increase the accountability of perpetrators of gender-based violence against women to end the widespread impunity for such acts. The Convention rightly considers that violence toward women is learned behavior and that behavioral change is possible through perpetrator programs for domestic violence and also for sex offenders, both within and outside the prison settings. Another important role for men is that of trained professionals working in this field. There are many groups of professionals who come into daily contacts with women and girls who have experienced a form of violence, be it domestic, sexual-based abuse, or forced marriage. These professionals need to be well trained on the different forms of violence against women, on the power dynamic at play, as well as on the need to respond in a gender-sensitive way with full respect for women's agency and with their empowerment in mind. However, the monitoring so far shows many gaps in many countries. Several professional groups, including police and legal professionals, but also social workers and also health professionals, do not receive initial or in-service training for the different forms of violence against women. The lack of training, the lack of a true understanding of the complexity of women's experiences of domestic violence, for example, the interlocking factors that keep women in abusive relationships, the high risk they run when they decide to leave, and the endless ways the abusers still continue to abuse, including after separation, contribute to explain why responses by statutory agencies fail women victims of violence time and again. That's why I just wanted to remind us that when it comes to opposing women's rights, alliances seem to be close-knit across all geographical boundaries. The transnational nature of the actors working against women's rights agenda has shown that the attacks that we are witnessing are not merely a pushback against perceived achievements by human rights proponents. We are witnessing a highly organized, well-funded, transnational movement working on the domestic and international level to undermine women's rights and civil society participation in policy discussion and also decisions. Understanding these features of the international anti-gender movement and placing them within the wider context of increasing anti-democratic tendencies is absolutely critical to developing effective strategies to counter them. In September 2022, the Minister of Justice of 37 member states of the Council of Europe gathered in Dublin and adopted a declaration on the prevention of domestic, sexual, and gender-based violence, committing to ensure the strategies aimed at preventing and combating violence against women, and also address the specific role of men and boys in preventing violence against women and developing specific measures aimed to involve them. Finally, just a note to inform you that the Council of Europe will soon adopt a guideline on the place of men and boys in gender equality policies to combat violence against women, prepared by the Gender Equality Commission. And Roberta Ola will tell you more about that very shortly. The guidelines provide a list of 12 measures to strengthen the role of men and boys to prevent and combat violence against women. They address some of the issues that we have mentioned here today so far, and I invite all the member states to apply them urgently. So I'm looking forward to the following of the discussion, and I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Ms. Nausari, for your insights. And now we'll start our first panel discussion on the need to eliminate harmful gender stereotypes. And to kick off the discussion, first I give the floor to Honorable Rebecca Buttigieg, who is our Parliament Secretary for Reforms and Equality, to present her few introductory remarks. You've got the floor.
Mr. Speaker, thank you, Dr. Abela, Dr. Dalli, Ms. Luarazi, distinguished guests. Engaging men and boys in violence prevention is imperative to achieve our shared common goal, that is, an equal society for all. Indeed, equality does concern all of us, irrespective of gender, because it has a strong impact on our daily lives and it determines our quality of life. Numerous international declarations have called for the meaningful involvement of non-violent men and boys in promoting gender equality and preventing violence against women. And along the years, we have seen a fundamental shift, questioning from why we should work with men and boys to how we work with men and boys. Research in Malta, including a relatively new one, such as the Safety in Childhood, a prevalent study of childhood abuse experiences in Malta that we have just presented last week, as well as the project Breaking the Cycle of Violence, an EU co-funded project, indicates that in Malta, more awareness is necessary around the themes of gender equality, the roles of women and men, and the autonomy of women. The findings indicate that more work needs to be done with young people through the education system to address gender stereotypes, bullying, bodily autonomy, and sexual relations towards a society that upholds equality and human rights at its very core. This includes, of course, educating our boys and young men to bring about change in behaviors and attitudes. And as a part of this effort, we are implementing a project named Safe Dates, a pilot project in Malta's secondary state schools with the backing of the Education Minister of the University of Malta, of PSCD education officers and PSCD educators. The aim of this project is to also teach adolescents about what a healthy relationship is when they start their very first relationship. As we all know, gender-based violence is a complex and wide-ranging issue, involving a multitude of factors embedded in culture, economy, law, but most intractably, our cultural constructions of masculinity. For too long, men's roles in the equation have primarily been seen as perpetrators or potential perpetrators of violence against women, but relatively little has been done to understand the root causes and how that understanding can be leveraged as a primary prevention strategy. And as we all know, violence does not operate in a vacuum. Perpetrators learn a substantial number of actions, values, and beliefs from growing up and from being part of the cultural context that they live in. Their values and beliefs are expressions of broader social forces, which in Malta are too often patriarchal in nature. And this is very much reflected in the studies that we have conducted. Such a limited and outdated concept of masculinity can not only be restrictive, but also very harmful. Despite the negative messages and problematic cultural norms that boys learn in this world, especially through social media, there are still many men who reject violence and refuse to use it in their relationships. So if we are able to tap into the aspects of our culture and men's attitudes that support gender equality and healthy relationships, we will start to see significant changes in the lives of women. Studies show us that everything from government policy and medical research to urban planning and technology, they are all designed in a way that benefit men far more than women. And yet, when it comes to violence against women or advancing gender equality, men are largely left out of these frameworks, of these policies, of these programs, and any indicator related to gender equality and violence prevention. So engaging men and boys as advocates, as allies, as change makers, and targeting the settings in which they live are underutilized strategies that hold promise in preventing and ultimately ending violence against women. Men need to be addressed as part of the solution, not just part of the problem. Men and boys need to be invited and challenged to critically reflect on the existence of patriarchy, male power, and privilege, to analyze the cost to women and girls, but also the costs to men and boys themselves. Combating violence against women requires a collective effort from all members of society, including men and boys. And as a government, we do recognize the important role that men and boys can play in ending gender-based violence, and we are committed to working to creating a safer and more equitable society for all. And by challenging these harmful behaviors, promoting gender equality, and first and foremost supporting survivors, we can create a society where everyone can truly live free from violence and fear. So I look forward to the discussion we are having here today, so that we look forward towards a brighter future where violence against women is no longer tolerated or even accepted. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Honorable Dejic, for your remarks. We now turn to our panelists. To introduce our panelists, we have Mr. Roberto Olla. He's the head of the Human Dignity and Gender Equality Department of the Council of Europe. We have Ms. Rini Laivera, Commissioner for the Promotion of Equality. We have Antoinette Vassallo, Commissioner for Children. We have Graziella Castillo, Director Agency Approach, and also Alexander Dimitrovic, who is the founder of the non-governmental organization Men Against Violence. Now, the first question is for you, Mr. Dimitrovic, with regard to gender stereotypes have been present since time immemorial, as you know. Now, my question is, what are the root causes behind them, and how have gender stereotypes evolved throughout the years? You got the floor. Please stand up.
Okay. So, hi. Gender stereotypes have a very, very old origin. We can trace them back to ancient times, to our storytelling times. You see them in our mythology, the stories of Eve, the stories of Pandora, of women doing, by their action, destroying or endangering the world of man. The ideas that women have to be, put in a particular box and controlled. You see this idea developing then in the work in ancient philosophers, in Aristotle, in the Church Father, Tertullian, Aquinas. They had these ideas, particular ideas about women, women role, and putting women in a particular box. The other side of it is also that the men are put in a particular box, and we tend to sometimes forget that being male is also a gender. So then these ideas have been and are still culturally enforced in the societies, often put in laws, and there are still laws which are discriminatory against women. And the result of this perpetual cycle is that the gender norms create gender inequality, that create a society which is built or structured around these ideas and these norms, where women then end up paying the price. As we've heard, most of the speakers so far mentioned that women are, by default, basically, the most likely to be victim of gender-based violence. But also, we also have a situation where these patriarchal norms are also damaging to men, in damaging for their mental health, damaging for their physical health, or the expectations that are built upon men to be risk takers, to be assertive, to be strong, to ignore their emotions, and so on and so forth. So these origins are old and require sort of, in order, they won't go out, they won't disappear on their own, and they require everyone and their dog to pull the same side of the rope in order for this to change. They won't go on, they won't disappear on their own, and they have to be confronted and dealt with in an organized and structural manner. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your in-depth analysis, which sets the scene for discussion. Now we shall look into how gender stereotypes impact gender equality. The group which is mostly impacted by stereotypes, of course, are children. So I invite Mrs. Vassallo, and I ask you, how do gender stereotypes at home impact the upbringing of children and their perceptions of gender equalities? And also, second question, or you take them both, what can be done by parents to break such stereotypes? You've got the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President, and good morning to all. Stereotypical generalizations are usually passed on from one generation to another and are encouraged by society at large, ranging from parents to education, peers, and media. While this may seem to be a trivial issue, it may have detrimental consequences on children, reducing their aspirations, limiting their career options, amongst other things. Parents may transfer their own biases to their children. Therefore, parents play a critical role in the development of their children. From a very young age, children should be nurtured, loved, and cared equally. A parent's relationship with a child is the foundation for their development. Children need positive role models, and parents should set a good example by challenging gender stereotypes, such as equal roles in the household, when it comes to nurturing, bonding, caring, playing, and even household duties. Spending time together as a family is important for a child to feel supported and to increase self-esteem. Parents should be emotionally open and accepting of their children regardless of their gender. Children should be encouraged to express their feelings regardless of their gender, and they should be supported to express their own sense of identity. Parents should, therefore, refrain from strongly assigning and asserting gender identities onto their children, but rather they should encourage them to develop their own sense of identity and agency in a nurturing and accepting environment. I believe that if children are raised solely on the basis of gender, rather than on their abilities and wishes, their talent may be wasted and children may be forced later in life into lifestyles and careers that deny personal satisfaction, and this might have serious effects on their physical and mental well-being. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Vassallo. Just to follow up on the previous question, now ask you, Ms. Rini Oliveira, how do perceptions by boys and girls on gender equality link to violence against women? With the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. It is a fact that we live in a patriarchal society, which means, and it is often declared, that we live in a man's world. We live in a man's world. It suffices to look at the statistics in our country in all sectors, and we can see who is the gender, the male gender, who is in control of how society basically lives. The question is, how do perceptions by boys and girls on gender equality link to violence against women? And I will build on my colleagues' contribution. Since day one of the birth of the child is being educated, is being formed. The messages, consciously and unconsciously, of the people around her or around him are very clear and are influencing this child, irrespective of what the ideal is. So as parents will definitely, and relatives, will definitely influence these children. So we are living in a patriarchal society, and the messages that we're giving to these children from a very young age is mainly a patriarchal one, which means that the boys are being brought up to believe that they are the strong masculine role, and girls are being brought up to being the weaker feminine roles. This is very, very important as from a young age, and we can see it then transferring into schools. If you look at what happens in primary school, even in kindergarten, we are seeing development of bullying, and bullying is usually, especially physical bullying, starts between boys and boys, power and control issues. So there we have it clearly, and the girls are watching this, are seeing this, are absorbing these norms. So the link between gender equality and violence against women is starting at a very young age. It's starting at a very young age. Boys and girls at school, we are seeing that our primary schools, our kindergarten, are void of male role models, and this is crucial. We need to work to get more positive men in our school education. Very, very important, I think. We have to look at the type of education we are giving to our children. The, gender equality education is not by choice. It should be mandatory in our syllabus. It shouldn't be left to the school or to the PSD teacher to decide to what extent this subject is dealt with, as is happening now. This is what I'm being told. So it is very,
Thank
very
you.
important that we work on these issues. If children are brought up to respect each other, boys and boys, girls and girls, but boys and girls together, they will end up, not always, but they may end up,
Conclude, please.
especially if at school at home, they have already seen violence and domestic violence, and that this may be reflected in their relationship as they grow older. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. I now invite Ms. Castillo and also Ms. Vassallo separately to give their views on what is the impact of children's exposure to violence against women and what can be done, of course, to effectively address the negative consequences of such exposure. You've got the floor, Ms. Castillo.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Children and young people can be both directly and indirectly affected by family violence. This is a fact. It's important to recognize children and young people as victims in their own rights and not an extension of their parents as victims. Children's experience of violence is different than adults' experience of the trauma of violent behavior. Recent literature and studies are nowadays making reference to children exposed to violence rather than just children witnessing violence. The reason being that whilst witnessing is linked to a direct experience, exposure to violence, at times not directly involved, is still a traumatic experience for children, and this is the experience of the daily encounters we face. Witnessing and exposure, thus, are both situations of abuse on children and young people. When we speak of children exposed to domestic violence, we need to constantly keep in mind that whilst physical abuse is the most obvious, emotional abuse is harmful just the same. And we have seen, even locally, an increase in emotional abuse of cases of domestic violence. Last year, Agencia Appoġġ had 975 cases of emotional abuse cases when compared to 625 cases of physical abuse. Children witnessing or being exposed to violence is associated with an increase in psychological, social, emotional, and behavioral problems, and also with substance misuse in teenage years and adulthood. In fact, studies and real case situations that we encounter show a link between family violence and external behavior. Another observation that we encounter in our practice is a link between child witnessing or being exposed to violence and abusive relationships in adulthood. How can we effectively address this situation? The most direct way is to eliminate violence and provide a stable and secure environment to children and young people. The timing of interventions responses is crucial, with research suggesting that when an adolescent needs help, intervention should follow quickly and intensively. Adopting a holistic treatment approach would be useful to gain a comprehensive understanding of children and adolescents' experience and thus maximize the impact of support to enhance their psychological and mental well-being. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, Ms. Vassallo.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Excuse me, I keep forgetting. Thank you. Exposure to violence against women violates children's rights and has a harmful effect on their development. Long-term or prolonged repeated traumatic experiences can disrupt the development of the brain, resulting in decreased cognitive functioning, memory loss, and post-traumatic stress disorder. Violence in the home denies children of a safe and stable home environment. Such exposure can cause problems with regulating their own emotions and have a negative impact on their relationships. Children have the right to live free from the threat of violence. The United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child emphasizes the need to protect children from all forms of violence. When violence is present, children are at greater risk being violent in future relationships. Children are more likely to face challenges in school and are at great risk of facing psychological, social, emotional, and behavioral problems, including drug and even alcohol abuse. So, early identification and intervention are key to supporting children who have been exposed to violence. Exposure to violence often requires different forms of intervention, including the improvement of the environment a child is being brought up in. Children should be provided with age-appropriate counseling so as to address underlying trauma. Measures should be put in place to empower children and to support them to build resilience. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much for your input. To continue on the theme of children and young people, since, as you know, the younger generation are becoming more social media savvy, it is important to factor into the social media element. Now, my question to you, both Ms. Vassallo and Graziella Castillo, is this: how is social media fueling gender stereotypes, especially among children and teenagers? And my second question is, what can be done to mitigate the negative effects? Ms. Vassallo, or okay.
Children and teenagers, Mr. Speaker, are constantly being exposed to messages. Excuse me. Yes. I'm very sorry. They are exposed to messages through social media on a daily basis, with some of these messages being targeted directly towards them. Such messages may shape their ideas and perceptions. Certain messages may also lead to children setting unrealistic expectations. Online advertising and marketing are continuously influencing the lives of children and teenagers. Picture-based social media platforms are regularly used by children and teenagers, and they are therefore being exposed to gender norms in relation to body image. My office carries out a number of focus groups with children, and on various occasions, children have opened up about needing to look a certain way on social media, as well as the negative impact of picture-perfect images created through the editing of photos to conform the female or male beauty. Unrealistic beauty norms and pressure to be perfect can impact children's perception of self, which can lead to confidence issues, mental health problems, and self-harm. Unrealistic body image can lead to unhealthy eating habits and disorders among boys and girls. Social media also has an impact on personal attitudes towards gender roles and may place unhealthy pressure on teens to conform gender stereotypes. Children's exposure to pornography, whether intentional or not, from an early age is also of great concern, as this may lead to poor mental health, sexism, objectification, and sexual violence, as well as other negative outcomes. So it is extremely important to raise awareness about these issues amongst children, parents, and educators, so that they can be addressed from a very young age. My office forms part of the Be Smart campaign, together with the Foundation for Social Welfare Service, the Ministry of Education, and the Cybercrime Unit. The issue of gender stereotypes is often addressed in our awareness-raising sessions so as to empower children to think critically when they are online. In today's day and age, children do not only look to their parents as role models. Influencers are a new form of role models, and due to their popularity, they have a great influence on children and teenagers. This influence could be both positive and negative, so we need, finally, to work together to limit the negative exposure of children online and to also use the media itself to promote positive messages to children and teenagers. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Now I'll give the floor to Graziella Castillo on the same questions.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Adding to what my colleague here, Ms. Vassallo, said, yes, it's a fact that media can play a significant role in the perpetuation of gender stereotypes through the various platforms, being television, music videos, video games, etc. Continuously providing beliefs and labels on young people through social media and placing young people in specific categories are harmful and affect the mental and well-being of both children and young people. Social media and the fear of missing out that comes along with it often lead to loneliness, depression, and anxiety, as we all know that social media is addictive. Thus, it is our responsibility as adults to guide and teach our children and young people to balance between their online and offline activities. As we all know and are aware of, the negative effects of social media on mental health are real and often lead to low self-esteem, fear, cyberbullying, amongst others. It is a known fact, and we need to acknowledge that social media is necessary in our daily lives, if used wisely. This is even more important for our children and young people who have been born and brought up in an era dominated by social media. Thus, I personally believe that to deal with the issue of gender stereotypes and violence against women, it can be tackled and promoted with our young generation by using the media itself. We need to use the media to educate and promote gender equality with our children by using and pointing out people who promote gender equality and using real-life and TV programs, whilst commenting positive on adverts that promote gender equality. Recognizing TV personnel who defy gender stereotypes, such as males and boys who are seen sad and crying. This should be the way forward, and our children and young people need to be alerted to such scenes and challenge the question: can a man or a boy be both strong and sensitive? I strongly believe that this is the role that education has to play if we want to have more boys fighting and combating domestic violence on women and girls. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Castello, and you, Mrs. Vassallo, for your insights. Now, I come now for questions to Roberto Olla and also Alexander Dimitrovich. Apart from the spread of gender stereotypes, which can, of course, fuel violence against women, we are seeing also across Europe the rise of anti-gender movements. Now, my question is, what is the impact of these anti-gender movements and their rhetoric in the promotion and adoption of policies related to combating violence against women? You could the floor, Mr. Roberto.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the Maltese authorities for inviting us from the Council of Europe to be here in Malta, and also the permanent representation of Malta in the Council of Europe. The anti-gender movement is a plethora of different movements, groups and subgroups of different origins. Some are ideological, some are religious. They are different, but they all are united in one objective, and that is fighting gender equality policies. That's the only thing that unites them. And it makes it very difficult to tailor-make policies that can target this anti-gender movement because it is so different. And it's part of a bigger picture of the anti-rights movement, the so-called backlash that we are witnessing in human rights and in gender issues as well. Let me focus a little bit on the anti-gender movement, and the anti-gender movement is an anti-feminist movement, essentially. And words are important here because we know that there is a group of associations that are called Men's Rights Association. And this Men's Rights Association defend men's rights just like women's rights associations defend women's rights. But within that category, you have a group called the masculinists. And those are promoting toxic masculinity. So we should not confuse the Men's Rights Association with this anti-feminist movement. They all consider basically that misandry, the hostility towards men, is provoked by feminism. Let me quote what can be quoted in this room because their words are harsh and not respectful. They say, in a nutshell, that men are in crisis because of the feminization of society. Feminism has gone too far and is making it too hard for men to succeed. Basically, gender equality policies are perceived as an attack to men's rights. They do not accept that it is an attack to men's privileges. And the gender equality policies are not depriving men on anything, are simply recognizing rights to women. It is essential that we take into consideration these groups because we heard how rooted gender stereotypes are in society and how difficult it is in general for gender equality policies to tackle this aspect. And there is a link, a direct link between gender stereotypes and violence against women. So taking into consideration this anti-gender movement, they're making gender equality policies even harder to be implemented is essential because otherwise we fail in recognizing women's rights and women's human rights. Thank you.
Thank you, Roberto. Now I ask Alexander Dimitrovic to address these two questions.
I want to thank you for basically saying half of the things that I prepared or wanted to say. I think it's essential to realize, especially people who are involved in politics and politics with a big P here, how organized the anti-gender movement is and how intersectional they are. They are coming from different perspectives, different beliefs, but they agree on these things, on issues of gender, and that works for them as a unifying force. I mentioned politicians with the big P because these people are very well funded. They have practically unlimited sources of money. There are reports done by European Parliament, done by NGO who work in this particular field, EPF in particular, which shows that they are working hard to undermine the progress on women's rights, on equality, on genders' rights, on equality, reproductive rights, LGBTIQ rights, because they all fall under one group that they try to oppose. They are very well funded, and as much as they oppose rights, they are ready to use the language of rights. So they talk about men's rights, they talk about parental rights, they talk about religious rights, and they're to find ways to obscure their actual target, which is actually erosion of the achievements so far. And you can recognize them because when they claim for some rights, they are basically describing usually their privileges, and most of their ideas and their policies are aimed at denying or being opposed to anybody else getting the rights that they already have. So that's the major difference, and it doesn't take much to recognize in which sphere the proponents for the rights or actually opposition to the rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we move to the focus of today's conference theme. Why should men and boys embrace gender equality policies and fight gender stereotypes when they are the privileged group? This is a question which I would like to ask again to you, Alexander, and to Rini. And the second question is, could you explain what is in it for men and boys to stand up to violence against women, and if there is any particular benefit for them for doing so? So we can start with you, Alexander.
Mr. Speaker, everybody else. I don't need to believe, I know that gender equality is good for all. And apart from statistical data, that we see that in any society, in any culture which is more gender equal, it's not only that we see a reduction in violence, gender-based violence, violence on women, but we also can see a reduction in violence on men. We talk about gender-based violence, and yes, women are predominantly the most likely to be victim of gender-based violence. But if you take a totality of violence in the society, men are the victims of most of the violence, with most of the perpetrators also being men. So men have 1,000,001 reasons to benefit from reduction of violence in the society, number one. We also know that, again, this is data, this is not a belief, that more power equal relationship is, on an individual level, men also benefit from, in every aspect, for better mental health, better physical health, less likely to experience breakdown in a relationship and a divorce. The children perform better in school on any level or any metric that we can apply. And not to mention that the gender equal relationship tend to also do better financially, and not to mention that the satisfaction in the relationship, emotional and physically, is better. We have data to show this. So men have a reason, actual, factual, statistically and data-driven reasons to be in support of gender equality. That said, it's very hard to get men involved. Because when it's mentioned gender, it gives men, that's something that women do, that's something that is, related to women, and they should take care of it and give men opportunity to brush it off their shoulder, and it's not the case. It's not the case, and we need more men to get involved and to speak out for gender equality and against violence. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alexander Dimitrievich. Now I call Rina Lavia on the same points.
Thank you. Alex, now it was your turn to take up all the arguments that I was. But you said something which got me thinking. First of all, you said it's hard to get men involved. Agree. But why? Are we really telling men, informing men about the negatives in their lives because of lack of gender equality, because of the presence of gender stereotypes in our society, in our daily life? Not all men are privileged. It is true that the privileged group are men, but not all men are privileged. As has already been mentioned, even looking at their upbringing and the way they are pushed into their stereotype, and they are limited even in their choices, in the choice of the life stream that they are trying to follow. They are being pushed in one direction, just as women are being pushed in one direction. True, we are pushing men to be the strong group, but not all men want to go there. They are not all by nature the tough guy that wants to control situations around him. There are men who want to have sane relationships with their peers and in their relationships with their partners. But the upbringing that we are giving them is not helping situations. Communications, how do we support them to express their emotions? To express when they're hurt. Men often enough find it extremely difficult because when they're young, from day one of their birth, the message is, look, you have to be strong. You mustn't cry. And this was not just the men. I was brought up like that at home. It was a rule in my house, in my home. You do not cry. Crying is weakness. Crying equals, and this, I'm a girl. I'm a girl, and this is the way we were brought up in our home. You have to be tough in life, because life is tough, and you have to face it. And this is one way to face it. So even more so for boys. This is what we're telling them. So they find it very, very difficult. And when they don't express themselves, they even find it difficult to go. It's a fact that men do not go visit the doctors as often as women do. They're strong, they're okay, there's nothing wrong with their health. When there is. So what are we doing to these men? How are we informing them of these negatives in their lives? This is institutionalized. Huh? We have to remember that we're talking about, we're making a lot of statements, and we're not saying the main thing. This is institutionalized gender inequality and imbalance of power in our society. And as the politicians are here, please listen and let us act. Change. We need to change the mentality within our institutions. Thank you.
Thank you. I turn again to you, Rini and Juan Vassallo. With regards to what extent does unconscious gender bias influence men and women in their choice of studies and, of course, employment, and how can this bias be consciously avoided? Antoinette.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The experiences of individuals in the family, school, and social life during their childhood may affect their gender roles and ultimately their career choices in the future. As children grow up, they start to shape their career choices, depending on their interests, aspirations, and abilities. Career choices are a crucial part of a person's life. However, not every individual can choose the career path they wish due to childhood experiences and gender roles which can affect this process. For example, I'm giving a small example. From the age of 3, children already distinguish occupations associated with women and men respectively, as if there were such things as women's jobs and men's jobs. Children, for example, they associate men with manual work, business, policies, whatever, whilst women are usually associated in healthcare, social services, arts, and naturally personal care. These are examples to show the differences of gender. But as Commissioner of Children, I believe that unconscious gender bias can be consciously avoided by exposing children and young people to different careers that are not constrained by gender stereotypes. And this should be done from a very young age. Educators should be provided with training to address their own unconscious gender bias, as well to promote gender equality in teaching practices. A whole school approach should be adopted to ensure safe spaces for all students, irrespective of their gender identity, gender expression, or sexual orientation. Support and awareness raising amongst parents are also beneficial, so as to address their own unconscious gender bias with the aim of providing them with the adequate skills to guide their children and to guarantee their children's rights to reach their full potential. Awareness campaigns for the general public are also required so as to address gender bias in choice of studies and employment. And I am sure that this will encourage children to follow their dreams without encountering obstacles related to gender norms. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Now I ask Rini Aviera.
Thank you, Mr. President. To continue on my colleague's contribution, we know we have facts, data, statistics. Segregation in education is very high in Malta, in our society. And this comes from, at a very young age, when children of 3 are already identifying jobs for women and jobs for men. Clear. And this is straight away the stream they're going to follow. This is the way they think. And they choose. And it's not only them. Obviously, it's the parents, it's the school. The school, crucial. What are we doing? What are we doing? Sometimes I talk to teachers and they tell me, But why should we interfere with children's choices? I say, sorry, you are not interfering. You need to change what is already the status quo, which the status quo is an imbalance. This is what we have to be aware of. We forget that there is an imbalanced status quo in our society. This is what we forget, because if we don't do anything, it means we agree with the status quo, and the status quo is an imbalance of power between women and men in our society. What does it mean when you have segregation in education? It means that the choices we make, children make in secondary schools usually will lead to choices they make in the careers they follow. Meaning that we have concentration of girls in the caring professions and concentration of boys in technology, engineering. Meaning that even though it may not have been their initial choice if they had been led to follow their wishes, their abilities, their whatever. Meaning that the women are always going to suffer from a gender pay gap, because these are the areas which pay less. Meaning that they're going to suffer from gender pension gap in their later years in life. This is what we're talking about. We're talking about feminization of poverty. We're talking about, because even in the areas where you have many women working in the lower levels, looking at the higher levels in decision-making, in health and education, we don't see a balance up there. Even in decision-making level, even in the areas where women are predominant. And this is very clear. What are we doing? Where are we going? And this is why I keep talking about institutionalization of an imbalance of power. So even in decision-making level, again, this is going to affect their income, their earnings, the way they bring up their children, their lives. Not to mention, because I haven't mentioned, sexual harassment at the place of work, which may lead, as we all know, to women having to leave their jobs, finding jobs which may not be of their choice because of the circumstances and the result and the effects of sexual harassment on their life. Thank you.
Thank you, Rini. Now I turn on to you, Roberto and Graziella. And the two questions that I have to ask you is, what is the relation between the promotion of men as caregivers and gender equality? And the second question is, how does it relate to fighting violence against women? Roberto.
Thank you. It is known, and it has already been said, that there is a gendered division between men and women in care work. I was looking at a statistic before COVID. In the EU, women spent 16 hours more than men every week on unpaid care works. Now, this number tells us something very clear. If this is the case, this is impeding women to play a role in the economic and political life as they should, because they have to take care of their children, of the elderly, of the family members with disabilities, and so on. Caregivers, women are on top of all the statistics, and caregivers and men are behind all of them, looking at basically all the countries, also those countries that have pretty advanced gender equality policies. Let's move to the paid care work. As already been mentioned, education, health, and welfare are predominantly women-related job. Last week, there was a conference in Strasbourg on the role of men and boys in gender equalities, and one of the major NGOs called Equimondo showed us a study according to which when men practice more emotional self-care, they do more care for others. Now, the link here, this is fundamental in my opinion, the link here is that gender stereotypes have segregated women to certain jobs and men to other jobs. But if men can participate, can be active in those jobs that are predominantly women's jobs, their behavior towards themselves would change as well. They would take care of themselves more. It's known that men have more risky behavior. They smoke more. They have more alcohol abuse. So there is a link between the image that we have of this profession and the care men have for themselves and they have for others. This is a fundamental link. Now, our policies need to tackle this. We need to change the representation that we have of these care, work, jobs in education, in health, so that men can be more active in these sectors. And this will break somehow these gender stereotypes, sexism, that leads to violence against women. So the link between caregivers and fighting violence against women is through the representation the society has until now of this paid and unpaid care work.
Thank you very much. Roberto, now I ask Graziella Castillo on the same questions.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Ola just mentioned the situation before COVID. Well, we all know that during the COVID-19 lockdowns, men have been involved more in care work than any other time in recent history. This was confirmed even through different research studies conducted, which showed that males' presence at home and with their children have increased considerably. What does this mean? This means that socially and psychologically, when fathers take on their fair share of care work, it can alter the nature of the relationships between man and woman, and also between man and children, and subsequently between women and children. Defying the norms will give space to new norms with new and different experiences for the individuals involved. Both fathers and mothers will have more time for their children. Women are released from some of their double burden, and fathers get to experience the stresses and the satisfaction of caring for their children. This is gender equality. Experiencing different roles and different situations gives space for more understanding of previous gender stereotypes, expectations, and will undoubtedly have an effect on how men can tackle the issue of violence against women. Encouraging and supporting men and boys in promoting and working towards gender equality, including, and I believe this is extremely important and essential, that of acting in partnership with women and girls as agents of change and in providing positive leadership, particularly where men are still key decision makers responsible for policies, programs, and legislation. It is essential that whilst promoting and encouraging campaigns initialized by men to tackle violence against women, budgets for such activities and initiatives are not taken from existing funds currently being used by female organizations, but should be seen as additional campaigning rather than a shift in the way campaigns are organized. Women organizations should continue with their lobbying and marketing campaigns, as leaving it only for male activists will unfortunately reinforce again gender stereotypes, indicating that male are the saviors of women in combating domestic violence. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Graziella. Now I come again to you, Alexander, and to Graziella. From your experience, what are the challenges which men and boys face in engaging in a fight against violence against women? And the second question is, does they vary widely across cultures? Alexander.
Mr. Speaker, well, the challenge to start off, first to start off with is that working with anything related to gender is not seen as manly. It's not. That's the first. So we are trying to deal with stereotypes, and the first obstacle, the first massive step is that involving men in such work, telling boys that this is something in their interest doesn't work because it's not seen as manly enough. It's not their job. Second thing is that when men do get involved, and there are, and I just want to briefly mention that there are many organizations, especially mentioning Council of Europe, there is an umbrella organization called Men Engage, Men Engage Europe, which I'm part of, which is again part of another Men Engage International, which has around 900 members, organizations of men or men-centered organizations which work specifically on engaging men, are active in each and every country. And so there are obstacles depending on the political system, on the political situation, and the level of gender equality which was already achieved in each and every country, obviously. But it also, the most important thing, again, it's coming from this gender that men have to be assertive leaders and taking charge. And there is a risk there of men being involved in the feminist movement and trying to overtake as leaders. We need to find ways and look into men as allies to gender equality rather than taking charge or taking lead in it, because it does not obviously affect them as much as others. So yes, there are different obstacles, but even those obstacles are rooted in the very, very inequality that we are trying to combat.
Thank you very much, Alexander. Now I call again Graziella Castello.
Mr. Speaker, yes, from my experience working in the social field and encountering regularly cases of victims of domestic violence, the local situation and the local data that we have matches very much with international statistics of victims of domestic violence. Last year, Agencia Appoġġ dealt with 2,121 victims of domestic violence. For the past 2 years, basically I'm quoting data of 2021 and 2022, the ratio of females and males seeking support as victims of domestic violence is that of 7:1. For every 7 females, we had 1 male who reported a situation of domestic violence. This brings me to my personal observation that whilst men feel embarrassed to seek help due to society's expectations, I believe it is similar to why men themselves find it difficult and challenging to engage in the fight against violence. Male activists are often met with suspicion and homophobia by fellow males who continuously question and ridicule their masculinity. This is possibly one of the challenges that men face in their fight of violence against women. Although research is still lacking in this area, some studies have indicated that defensiveness and helplessness as to where to start and what should I do dominate the challenges that men face in present. Although the majority would want to support and act, most of them question what and how they should tackle this issue. Right from young age, as we have been discussing this morning, our behavior is shaped by society's expectations. Thus, defying the norms is not an easy task. And most men and boys fear they will be rejected, ridiculed, and seen as lacking stamina. The individual's behavior, beliefs, and attitudes plays an important role. However, society and the community's expectations dominates what men actually believe and communicate. Society places a lot of pressure on men to keep up with how history has formulated the male and the female. At times, this goes beyond what they actually believe or their real life situations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Graziella Castello. Now I have a question to you, Roberto, because it concerns practically the Council of Europe. As you know, within the regional context, we have seen an increase in recent years, and particularly months, in focus on the role of men and boys in combating violence against women, particularly at the Council of Europe. So the question is, why is the Council of Europe so invested in dealing with this aspect, and how is it evolving? Actually, it's involving boys and men. This question.
Thank you for this question. There are essentially two measures, two instruments that are being worked on in the Council of Europe concerning men and boys in gender equalities and in policies fighting violence against women. The first one is a resolution of PACE at the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe that should not be confused with the European Parliament. The PACE is the delegations of national parliaments, like the Maltese, that are represented within the Council of Europe. And Senator Petra Stinen from the Netherlands has made a report on the role of, and responsibility of men and boys in stopping gender-based violence against women and girls. That led to a resolution number 2480 of this year on this topic. So I invite you, it's fresh, not been promoted yet, so I invite you to have a look at this report. But I would like to talk more about another instrument that is currently being discussed by the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe, that is the guidelines of the role of men and boys in gender equality policies and fighting violence against women. These guidelines are a toolbox for member states of the Council of Europe that contains basically possible measures that can be adopted and implemented and adapted to the different legal cultures in Europe in order to make, to have men and boys as allies, as agents of change, as bystanders in fighting violence against women. And where did we get those measures? So we made a study in 2021 following a research that was made by the European Union, according to which the European Union, it was the FRA, the Agency for the Fundamental Rights, that made a study in 2021. According to this study, 68% of acts of physical violence against women were perpetrated by men, and 81% of acts of physical violence against men were perpetrated by men. Men are perpetrators, essentially. So why are we only working on women's rights and we're not working on men? That is what the Council of Europe is doing now. And the study that we did was basically trying to understand what were the best practices already existing in member states, not inventing anything from scratch, but observing what all the European countries had done. And we picked and chose the best practice that had a more impact on society. We have streamlined them and transformed them into guidelines. I know I'm running out of time, but let me tell you only the 4 points that are tackled by these guidelines. Measures focusing men and boys as agents of change and on countering resistance to gender equality. That's what we have been talking until now. Second, measures to reduce the negative impact on sexism, social norms, and gender stereotypes on men and boys because they are victims themselves of those gender stereotypes. Measures focusing men and boys for the promotion of gender equality in care. We just spoke about care services, PED and UNPED. And finally, measures to strengthen the role of men and boys in action to prevent and combat violence against women. Why would men stop violence of other men? So this is a package of measures proposed to member states. They can inspire themselves and adapt those measures for their own legislation.
Thank you, Roberto, and thank you all. Now we reach the end of the panel discussion. However, I would like to ask one final question to all the panelists. My question is, what can men and boys do to effectively combat violence against women? And also, second question is, could you elaborate on what you consider the most effective approach? I'll start with you, Irina.
Thank you, Mr. President. I think, as I've already highlighted the issue of institutionalized inequalities, we need to look at our institutions. We have been government policy on gender mainstreaming. The strategy of implementing gender mainstreaming strategy has been part of government policy since the year 2000. The NCPE, the National Commission for the Promotion of Equality, regularly since that year practically, has been receiving reports about the implementation of gender mainstreaming in the different departments, the different ministries. Every year, and we receive over 100. And because the amount of reports that we receive is on the increase, very good. But the issue is that the understanding of the strategy is that it has to do only with human resources. And we keep saying, this is not only about human resources. It is about the daily work of government, the policies of government, the actions of government, the budgeting of government. This is where and we have to push harder. I know that the human rights Directorate now has a strategy and an action plan to implement mainstreaming, but we have to focus a lot on training. If the public officers do not understand what the strategy is and how to implement it, even if we have a plan, it is not easy to implement without understanding what it is all about, what the objective is, where we want to go, and why, with what results. And so please, we need to work a lot on the gender perspective in all government work, but we have to back it with constructive, effective training. Thank you.
Thank you. I call Antoinette Vassallo.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Boys and men should foster an attitude of respect. Gender name-calling sends the message that women and girls are inferior, which makes it easier to treat them with disrespect and violence. Boys and men should not be embarrassed to speak up against such behaviors and attitudes. Violence is too normalized in our society due to the media that we consume. Boys and men should be critical and question how the media portrays girls and women. Normalizing conversations about issues relating to consent and the use of violence is an important step in dismantling the taboos and stigmas that keeps violence against women so pervasive. Finally, addressing violence against women is every bit as beneficial to boys and girls. And when it comes to learning positive gender norms, if we leave the boys behind, then the problem becomes even greater. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I call now Alexander Dimitrovic.
The only thing that I want to convey is that the fact is that we are dealing with something that exists and persists and has been perpetuated for hundreds and thousands of years. It's crucial to have good laws. There's no question about it. It's crucial to have policies that support the victim and deal with the perpetrator. There's no question about it. And as it is, we don't put enough money in it. We don't put enough resources in it. And we need to work more and better on that. But that, as long as we handle that and only that, the problem will remain. Because that's a symptom of a problem, the inequality, the prejudices, the stereotypes, the position is the problem, and that requires culture change. And culture change will not, again, I emphasize, good laws and good policies are important and need to be bettered up, but in and by themselves, they won't change anything. It will remain putting a plaster on a wound that remains open. So we need whatever we need to do, and everybody to pull same rope, education, work with schools, work with parents, work with people that provide services, with everyone, with victims, with perpetrators. That all has to come together, but the policy has to be long-term. That has to be, we need to plan what are our targets, what we can realistically achieve in 5 years. And then after 5 years, let's review that. What can we do in 10, 15, 20, 25? Implement educational changes, implement other changes, but it has to be seen long-term because we are fighting something that has always been there, and we won't change it overnight. I know it's, especially when it comes to, financing these kind of changes and this kind of ideas and this kind of talk, like talking to politicians, or you expect to show some tangible change or success of your policies in 5 years or 4 years of the electoral cycle, but this won't happen like that. So we need, and I, again, appeal to a politician to look at this as a long-term project, which maybe in 25 years somebody else will get credit for, but it's for benefit of everyone and should be done and dealt with like that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I call now Graziella Castillo.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I fully agree with what my colleagues just mentioned here, and I will conclude with 4 comments and approaches which I believe are effective, and basically one of them will be that the working with men and boys should reflect approaches that are integrated and in joint partnership with women. We need to invest more in early prevention particularly in our education system. The way forward maybe should see also men acting as mentors to boys and young males by encouraging and promoting partnership with females in combating this phenomena of domestic violence. And lastly, we need men and boys to be effective and active bystanders to tackle this delicate, sensitive and important issue in our society. Thank you.
Thank you. And finally, I call again Roberto Olla.
I think it is essential to underline the need for primary and secondary prevention of violence against women. One cannot be serious in fighting violence against women if you do not prevent it. Secondary prevention is necessary. The perpetrators programs have been mentioned, but perpetrators program, the crime has already happened. So prevention, like in medicine and in healthcare, is essential. It has already been mentioned gender mainstream. The gender mainstreaming is practiced in the Council of Europe since the late 90s. What it is the acknowledgement that women and men have different needs, have a different access to resources, to power, to money, and pretending that this is not existing would make any policies, education policy, any sort of policies in a country not effective. So gender mainstreaming is taking into consideration that men and women have different access to resources, and therefore policies needs to be adapted to that. We mentioned COVID. We had a peak of violence against women during the COVID period. That was foreseeable. Of course it was foreseeable. If those measures that were taken to tackle COVID pandemic had been gender mainstreamed, this would not have happened. So gender mainstreaming is key, including the role of men and boys in fighting violence against women.
Thank you very much, Roberto, and thank you all, the speakers, for the comprehensive views on this topic. We have some minutes for anyone who wants to ask a question to the panelists before we proceed, if there are any questions. If there are no questions, then of course we can continue on with the program. We have a short informative video by the Council of Europe about the Istanbul Convention.
The Istanbul Convention is the most far-reaching international legal instrument on violence against women, and it recognizes violence against women as a form of discrimination and a human rights violation. That is what makes it so innovative and groundbreaking. The Istanbul Convention is based on 4 key pillars, and these are prevention, protection, prosecution, and what we call integrated policies. The area of prevention, of course, is important to make sure that violence against women does not take place in the first place.
Un uomo che non agisce più violenza significa che c'è una donna che quella violenza non la subisce più, così come non soltanto la donna, ma eventuali figli minori coinvolti.
CAM is a perpetrator program. It's the first in Italy that was founded in 2009. We believe that it's really important to have a mixed team working, social workers, educators, psychiatrists, because it's very important to consider the different aspects of violence.
Era il fatto che ogni volta in cui si scatenava una discussione io provassi una rabbia bestiale. Con l'attività di gruppo, ecco, lì mi si è aperto un mondo, perché mi rendevo conto che le dinamiche, le storie che venivano raccontate dagli altri membri del gruppo erano identiche alle mie.
Io faccio gruppi con uomini che hanno reati di maltrattamento domestico o che comunque chiedono di accedere al servizio per problematiche riguardanti la genitorialità, la comunicazione e la gestione della rabbia. E lavoro anche tanto all'interno dell'ambito carcerario. Io ritengo che l'attività all'interno del carcere sia essenziale per poter riuscire a interrompere qualsiasi tipo di comportamento violento. Ma se noi ci mettiamo nell'ottica di voler eliminare la violenza sulle donne, è importante appunto agire di prevenzione.
Questo lo dico anche rispetto ai bambini che assistono alla violenza, c'è la necessità che non solo si sentano protetti, ma che sentano che il genitore che è stato violento si assuma la responsabilità di ciò che è accaduto e quindi della violenza commessa e possa attivare così un processo di ricostruzione, di cambiamento e quindi anche di rirelazione con i propri figli.
Women and children must at all times be kept safe in the work with perpetrators. So ensuring coordination and cooperation between the perpetrator program and a domestic violence shelter, for example, is very important. Another key principle is that perpetrators must take accountability for their acts. The area of protection of victims and women and girls at risk is extremely important because it sets out crucial measures that governments must take in order to provide support and protection to women victims and their children.
Je m'appelle Sophie, j'ai 33 ans et je suis ingénieure qualité dans l'industrie pétrolière. J'ai été mariée pendant 1 an. Et en fait, au début, ça se passait bien. Sauf que, on va dire vers la fin de la première année, mon ex-conjoint a basculé totalement dans la violence physique et psychologique. Un harcèlement moral par des phrases du style « t'es qu'une merde »,« t'es moche ». Et puis, ça a basculé totalement dans la violence et ça m'a coûté 2 côtes cassées et une entorse cervicale. J'ai cru en fait que j'allais mourir, qu'il allait me tuer en fait. Quand on est dans ce genre de situation, on a besoin d'accompagnement psychologique, on a besoin d'une aide juridique, on a aussi besoin peut-être d'une protection et c'est compliqué de tout gérer.
Je suis gynécologue obstétricienne et il y a bientôt 5 ans, j'ai fondé le lieu où nous sommes, qui est la Maison des Femmes de Saint-Denis. C'est un lieu qui est dédié entièrement aux femmes victimes de violences vulnérables et qui ont des parcours complexes. Voilà.
Il faut que je vous montre.
Nous offrons aux femmes une prise en charge qui est à la fois médicale, chirurgicale, psychologique, sexuelle, avec des groupes de parole, avec des ateliers d'amélioration de l'estime de soi, avec une prise en charge du corps, puisque une agression sexuelle comme l'excision attaque le corps et qu'il faut aussi réparer le corps.
Alors, ce qui se passe chez vous, c'est que l'exciseuse, quand vous étiez petite...
L'ensemble de ce parcours permet à ces femmes de mieux comprendre ce qu'elles subissent, ce qu'elles ont subi.
Je suis Sila Fatima, j'ai 18 ans et je viens de la Côte d'Ivoire. Je viens à la Maison des Femmes pour souvent passer du temps parce que ça me fait du bien d'être à la Maison des Femmes. Ils m'ont soignée et ils m'ont aidée, ils m'ont soutenue. Au début, je faisais atelier danse orientale et puis karaté et puis le groupe de parole F6 parce que j'ai été F6 et puis je subi un mariage que je n'aimais pas. C'est pour ça que je suis partie parce que j'étais mariée de force et je me suis dit que si je ne partais pas aujourd'hui, j'allais finir comme ma soeur Assa. Et aujourd'hui, elle n'est plus de ce monde.
Bonjour.
Nous sommes là pour les accueillir et pour les soutenir. On aborde les questions des traumatismes et des états de stress post-traumatique sévères et très importants.
Le fait d'être avec des gens qui ont un peu le même parcours que moi, je me dis que je ne suis pas seule. Quand tu sors d'un groupe de parole, tu te sens genre comme si tu avais une boule dans la gorge. Et après, à ta sortie, tu te sens un peu libre.
This is an area where Grevio, the independent group of experts, has repeatedly said in several of its reports that they need to be rolled out in a bigger effort, and that more such services must be made available. And this is especially true for services for women who may be at risk of female genital mutilation or forced marriage, some of the forms of violence that see the least amount of specialist support services available. The area of prosecution is important because it shows that measures must be taken to ensure that perpetrators are held accountable.
According to previous legislation in Sweden before July 2018, to be convicted for rape, it was required that the participation in a sexual act was due to use of violence or threat, or that someone was in a particular vulnerable situation because of alcohol or drugs, or they were sleeping. But now, since July 2018, we have new sexual legislation. Consent has to be expressed by words, by actions, or some other way. If it's not consensual, it can be rape.
BRÅ is a knowledge center for crime prevention in Sweden. We studied what effects the law had had on the amounts of convictions, and we got a very positive picture of the effects of the changes. The convictions went up with 75% in 2017-2019. So that's a big change. And the change is not only due to that new kinds of cases have been convicted. We could see that even if they couldn't prove that there had been violence, they could at least prove that there was no consent. And so the convictions went up for that reason.
Two other circumstances that since 2018 are criminalized now, that is negligent rape and negligent sexual abuse. That means that the offender should have realized or assumed that the other participation in the sexual act was not by free will, but they did nothing to find out. It doesn't have to be oral consent. It can be body language or some other circumstance that is depending on the situation.
The fear and shame among female victims to report that they have been abused and raped has decreased. More women dare to report what they've been part of.
It's a bit early to say whether it is a big change in society so far, but I do think the law will have a normative effect in the long run. The important issue is whether he made sure that it was consensual. So it is a swift, and hopefully it will help shaping our minds and ideas and our behavior.
The Grevio report on Sweden, in fact, found the definition in place in Sweden since a few years very interesting, because it's a very convincing example of what it means to really protect the sexual integrity of a person. Integrated policies, the idea here really is to make sure that responses to violence against women, to the different forms, that foresees a role for every professional involved.
Kam 17 vite që me martuar, të fejojnë të martohen gjithë në një moshë caktuar, edhe po se si ishte burri nuk e njihja. Isha parë kështu e njihja, por më tepër nuk dija gjë. Edhe ka filluar pastaj më një dhunë fizike, psikologjike. Ai justifikonte veten sepse ishte punë, sepse kështu ishte stresuar, edhe gjithçka unë bëja ishte gabim, gjithçka unë thoja ishte gabim.
që mbas dite, me grushta pa pushim, vetëm mbas kokë, dritë më bën sy. Nuk reagoja, nuk mund bëja dot asgjë. Pastaj më hodhesh në divani edhe më futi durët në fyt. Dukesh vetja në fund fare në atë mënyrë.
Vërtet është e vendosur në mënyrë konfidenciale në Tiranë. Ne kemi nevojë, po themi, për bashkëpunimin me institucionet e tjera, siç janë zyrat e punës, zyrat e shërbimeve sociale, zyra e strehimit social në bashki, në mënyrë që rasti të ketë një reintegrim, po themi, sa më të lehtë dhe që të minimizojmë shanset që të rasti të kthehet, po themi, tek dhunues.
Pastaj të nesër mëngjes e telefonova policinë. Edhe ja shpjegova më sollën tonë në qendër në Tiranë. Në qendër kam një muaj edhe më mbështesin në gjendjen emocionale. Po bashkëpunojnë me të sistemohem diku edhe të jem bashkë me 2 fëmijët.
The referral mechanism is a mechanism of hope. It's like the light at the end of the tunnel for many women and girls who have been abused. So the 3 key institutions are the municipality, the police, because the police provides a service 24 hours, 7 days a week, and health services, of course, because a lot of the times survivors of domestic violence, they suffer from injuries and damages, so they do go to the health centers.
Këtyre viteve ka patur ndryshime që janë shumë domethënëse dhe signifikative, si po themi për mbrojtjen e viktimës, por edhe për ndëshkimin e dhunuesve.
The referral mechanism in Albania is a good example of coordination at local level around individual cases of domestic violence. This is an example of where several professionals are brought into the case management at local level so that the different needs of a woman can be looked after in a really professional and also a faster way.
La Convention d'Istanbul est sans doute le premier outil un peu contraignant pour les États et qui décrit clairement dans quel domaine il faut s'améliorer. Donc elle est extrêmement précieuse. On ne peut pas imaginer qu'un pays puisse dire ce sujet ne m'intéresse pas. Aujourd'hui, dire ça vous renvoie au Moyen-Âge et c'est insoutenable.
Every time that the victim's rights have been violated, we have a term of reference for providing to do better.
Konventa e Stambollit dhe rekomandimet e Grevios na ndihmon të kuptojmë më mirë, le të themi, instrumentat gjithëpërfshirëse për eliminimin e të gjitha formave të dhunës ndaj gruas.
All member states should ratify the Istanbul Convention because it is a really strong tool to ensure the rights of women and girls to lead their lives free from violence.
Over the past 10 years, the Istanbul Convention has given hope to millions of women and girls in Europe. And it is really one of the most fundamental human rights treaties that keeps women and girls safe from violence and that offers them a way out. It really needs to be implemented to fulfill its potential also in the decades to come.
Tayyip Mala, we can now proceed to session 2. That is the importance of adopting an intersectional approach. And now we start with the second panel, a discussion for today on the importance of adopting an intersectional approach. And to introduce the subject, I would like to give the floor to Honorable Graziella Talprevi. She's a member of the opposition and also the spokesperson for equality, children's rights and human rights. You got the floor.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker, distinguished guests and honourable colleagues. To add to what already has been said during this conference, I would like to start by saying that the problem of violence against women is of an immense magnitude and has far-reaching consequences. In fact, 1 in 3 women in the EU, totaling around 62 million women, have experienced physical and/or sexual violence. And this was revealed in the European Parliament interim report on the proposal for a Council decision on the conclusion by the European Union of the Council of Europe Convention on preventing and combating violence against women and domestic violence, and this was issued in February 2023. I have heard also this morning several interventions that concur that the starting point to address this problem is education. Firstly, this can be achieved by raising awareness about violence and educating the general public about the issue and the different forms of violence against women. This could be done through social media, adverts, and printed communication. And also needed is a re-evaluation of the traditional male role model, whereby the aggressive, traditional macho traits should be replaced with a more rational and compassionate role model. Secondly, the problem may also be addressed by using formal schooling as a channel to educate boys about the issue and to challenge and change the attitudes that contribute to violence against women. Schools could also be instrumental in instilling in boys a sense of responsibility to actively work for a safer society for everyone. The lessons learned at school on how to resolve conflict, how to manage emotions, and the importance of empathy can provide lifelong lessons on how to avoid restoring to violence. Moreover, textbooks, videos, and other resources used at school could all advocate a zero tolerance to violence approach. Education and health professionals can be the first to identify boys who are living in a home environment where violence is condoned. This type of behavior has to be unlearned, and the state should provide specialized programs for this. Examples: adult males experiencing underlying conditions that might predispose them to violence against women, such as a tendency for morbid jealousy or anger problems, should be offered free behavior therapy sessions. Or another example, once a female has reported her male partner of violence towards her, the male should be obliged to undergo a psychological assessment and, if need be, attend the necessary obligatory training or therapy sessions on anger management, conflict resolution, or emotional intelligence in relationships. Nonetheless, I want to end on a positive note, and this has also seemed to be, all of us seem to be agreeing on it. Males can actually act as ambassadors for a safer society for women. Yes, actors, artists, singers, footballers, politicians could all actively campaign against violence against women. They could be involved in supporting victims of violence. They could be vocal in raising awareness and promoting a more equal society. And they could also support NGOs working on this issue. In doing so, they would be positive models for other males. And to conclude, the way forward should be guided by the experiences of victims of violence themselves. Their recommendations should be at the core of any proposed measure or initiative. Let us continue to strive and believe that together, females and males can work together for a safer and more equal society. Thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Attal-Previ, for your remarks. Now to introduce the panelists of the session, I welcome Professor Marceline Naudi, a member and also former president of Grevio, Audrey Frigieri, Commissioner for Gender-Based Violence and Domestic Violence, Dr. Claire Azzoppa-Delaine, Deputy Dean of the Faculty for Social Wellbeing at the University of Malta, Mr. Michael Camilleri, Director of the Human Rights Directorate within the Ministry for Home Affairs and Security, Reforms and Equality, and finally, Mr. Brian Farrugia, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Victim Support Agency. Now, to start and kick off the discussion, the first question is to you, Audrey, is what does the concept of intersectionality mean, and why is this approach important in tackling violence against women and domestic violence? You got the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Good morning, everyone. Indeed, this is a conversation that does respect to our human complexity. It deals with complexity. And it is with pleasure today that I will speak about intersectionality, because it is about justice as well. It allows us to emerge as multi-layered individuals, because we all experience whatever we do, including violence, including abuse, in our own unique ways, depending on where we stand, our social location, our identity too. Recently, I wrote an article in the paper about challenging the notion of labels. It was called, which victim are we talking about? Which survivor? There are women who resist being called victims, who resist being called survivors, because it summarizes their very complex experiences. So it's interesting to realize that the words we use also need to be interrogated from an intersectionality lens. Intersectionality and masculinity's work with men must consider how masculinity intersects with other axes of identity and social location, such as race, ethnicity, class, sexuality, religion, ability, age, and so forth. Applying an intersectional analysis to masculinities and the lived realities of men is a vital part of this work and is important for engaging men and masculinities in the prevention of violence against women. In the late 1980s, Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term intersectionality, a concept developed to further understand and analyze the ways in which gender and race interact and shape the specific experiences of oppression that Black women face. At that time, it's where it came from. Here, Crenshaw draws on and extends the work of earlier feminists and other women of color. Crenshaw describes the oppression and discrimination experienced by Black women due to their race, so being Black, and their gender, being women. Crenshaw describes the ways in which this oppression occurs, structurally through systems and institutions, politically through the exclusion of Black women. At that time, she focused on that particularly from the women's movement, and representationally through cultural norms and stereotypes. Despite her focus on gender and race, Crenshaw also acknowledges the range of other intersections at play, that there is a need to account for multiple grounds of identity when considering how the inquiry into family, domestic and sexual violence social world is constructed. Thus, someone's gender can interact with other axes of identity and systems of power based on class, sexuality, ability, age, and so forth to produce a particular experience of the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we come to you, Professor Marcel Einaudi, and my question is to link with what has been just said, how can intersectional violence be measured?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and hello to everybody. It's good to be here, and it's good to welcome also my Council of Europe colleagues that I'm very, very pleased that they are in Malta. How can it be measured? how can it be measured? Well, how do we measure things? We measure things using data. We measure things using research and data. How are we doing on the data front? Generally, even if we consider the findings of Grevio, not only specifically to Malta, but obviously more widely, data is one of the areas that, in fact, many countries are not doing so brilliantly at. Many countries collect data, as indeed so do we, but often that data is not harmonized across institutions and agencies. So we have police who collect data, and that's very good. We have the Foundation for Social Welfare Services that collect data, and that is very good. Sadly, we do not have the courts who collect data, sadly, so we cannot say that that is very good at all, in fact. The health collects some data, but again, it's difficult to always identify how it relates to everything else. So even if we're just looking at violence against women and domestic violence, we already have a problem. We already have a problem because the data that we collect doesn't speak to each other. So we cannot really say overall what the situation is. What we always ask for in Grevio is that we have data that is able to be followed through a system so that we are able to say we have so many women who went to the police, who were referred to domestic violence shelters, who were helped by the social workers, who then received free legal aid, who then went to court, and who then... We don't have this. We cannot follow the people through. But even if we're just talking about violence against women, what we ask for is disaggregated data. So we ask for not just the number of women or the number of men. We ask for the details of the victim and the details of the perpetrator, so the age, the nationality, etc. And of course, if we are looking at intersectionality, we need even more. We need as much data as possible so that we can say, look, we have had, 5 female same-sex couples who reported to the police in relation to violence, intimate partner violence. We have had 10 Serbian women victims who reported to the police about violence against women. So we need not only the sex and the gender of the victim and of the perpetrator, the possible relationship between them, but then we need a lot more information also about both the victim and the perpetrator. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Marcel Naudi. Now I ask Mr. Brian Farrugia and also Dr. Clara Zoppa-Delane this question. Why is intersectionality necessary in the provision of support service to victims? You got the floor, Brian.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Basically, victim support services in Malta are on a continuous development process. They are evolving, meaning that we are offering more services, but yet we are having more demand, mostly when it comes also to violence against women. Lately, we have put forward a project which is known as the Victim Support Agency, where we are acting as a national focal point for different victims of crime. And together with our colleagues who are also working in the same field, we are trying to promote victims' rights and also put forward and facilitate access to victim support services. As my colleague, Professor Naudi has said, yes, we agree with data segregation, and we are doing our best to collect data and follow up with the victim from point A to point Z as well. Well, this also brings us to a point where it is clear that intersectionality is very important to our work. And most often we compare intersectionality as a strategy tool for the creation of a preventive strategy. But we use it the other way around. We use it to assess the victim in a way that we can help out the victim as much as possible. For instance, it helps us out to identify the different identities and characteristics of the person. Also helps us out to identify the victim's actual relationship with the perpetrator, the level of dependency with the perpetrator, and also effects from other previous experiences of crime. It is also, just to put you in the picture, may I give you an example of a case that we have encountered. Imagine a third country national married in Malta, living in Malta, subjected to physical and psychological harm, with no relatives living here in Malta, nor any means to get in touch with her loved ones in the country of origin. Imagine that poor person being abused and violated. How is she going to get herself informed and access the services from our country? Well, once we get a quick analysis of her status and, as I said, intersectional approach, we can at least see that she requires clear and credible information, requires shelter and protection, and above all, requires emotional support, legal guidance, and accompaniment in court. Thanks to this assessment, we can actually have a holistic view of the needs of the victim. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I call Dr. Clea Tsopadele.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As my colleague said, we know that people from minority groups find themselves in positions of vulnerability. And I like to use the phrase, positions of vulnerability, and I do not put them as the vulnerable persons because they find themselves in those positions. They are not intrinsically vulnerable. And we should start, I think, with evaluating the individual needs of these minority groups, including the way information is distributed to meet their needs in terms of language, in terms of accessibility, to read that information, to acquire that information. And we should also look at lifelong education, information, and support, and focus on age groups that maybe we forget about, not just the minority status. And accessibility, when it comes both to accessing services and reporting, we know, for example, persons with disability find it very difficult to access services and access the justice system. So I think services there need to focus on the required needs of the individual person. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I move to ask Mr. Michael Camilleri and also Professor Marcellin Naudi. And my question is now, how can intersectionality approaches be integrated into policies and also violence prevention programs?
The concept of intersectionality is a quite recent approach. I must say that not all current policymakers are aware of it, and the first step would be to make them aware of intersectionality and the benefits of adopting an intersectional approach and the policies they are creating. A second factor would be to dedicate resources to students, which will be our future policymakers, and ensure that through their education and their educative development, they can be adopting the intersectional approach in their thoughts in the near future when they join the workforce. Expertise plays an important role, both in policy making and in violence preventive programs. There must be experts on equality and human rights to assist, train, and coach policymakers and ensure that an intersectional approach is there throughout. An intersectional-based approach ensures that no one is left behind. And in the fight for justice and equality. It prevents combating one form of discrimination at the expense of another form of discrimination. It ensures that communities and movements are inclusive of diversity and work together towards equality, remove systematic injustice and institutional inequality. At the Human Rights Directorate, we have the remit of many of the characteristics of intersectionality, and we have developed national strategies and action plans, such as the LGBTIQ Strategy and Action Plan, the Gender Equality Mainstreaming, Anti-Racism Strategy and Action Plan, Integration, and others which are being developed. The intersectional approach is an integral part of all the strategies. A common measure is the Inter-Ministerial Committee, who are representatives from the main stakeholders of each strategy and regularly meet to discuss the developments, the implementation, and the way forward of their respective measures. Each member of the Interministerial Committee has to provide a ministerial action plan, and through the committees, one-to-one meetings, workshops, and other means, we approach them, we coach them, and encourage them to introduce the perspective of the intersectional approach. And finally, we review the plans which they provide and revise if necessary. So I must say, experts in equality must be part of all policymaking and violence-preventing programs to ensure integration of the intersectional approach.
Thank you, Mr. Camilleri. Now I call Professor Marcel Naudi to address the same question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I agree with everything that has been said before me. I mean, it's very important that in our action plans, national action plans, strategies, etc., that the concept of intersectionality is included. I'd like to just add a couple of words on that, because we've said intersectionality, and we've said, we've mentioned specific groups who find themselves in a vulnerable position or who are emarginated by our society. But one thing which maybe hasn't been stressed, or maybe I missed it, is that we're talking about intersectionality. So we're not just talking about somebody being Serbian or somebody being disabled. We're talking about the intersectionalizing, for want of a better word, of these different aspects in the one person. And one thing which we know very clearly is that it is not 1 + 1 + 1 = 3, so this person has intersectionality. They intersect in weird and wonderful ways which are not linear. So maybe just to also keep that in mind. The other thing I think we really need to keep in mind is this saying that I have used in class for about 200 years, in class I mean in lectures at the university, which is, there is nothing more unequal than the equal treatment of unequals. So if our national action plans and our strategies do not take into consideration people who our society does not treat equally, but only considers the mainstream part of our society, then we are actually further disadvantaging. We are not only not meeting their own specific needs, but we are actually further disadvantaging them within our society. And I think that we really need to take this on board. It's not just, disabled people who have a mobility impairment need a ramp. It's not just, if we do not meet the specific needs of the whole of our society, but specifically marginated groups, because our society specifically marginates these groups, then we are not dealing with intersectionality, and policies, strategies, national action plans, very important that they specifically cater for the needs of all. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Marcel Naudi. Now, to link with our conference team, the next question to you, Audrey Frigieri, is how does the concept of intersectionality relate to the notion of engaging men and boys in combating violence against women?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, it does relate, in the same way that it relates to women. When we say perpetrators, what perpetrators are we talking about? Just like when we ask, which victims are we talking about? You know, someone from a disadvantaged background cannot have the same experience of abuse and violence like another person who has resources, for example. In recent work addressing men and masculinities in the prevention of violence against women, there has been a resounding call for a greater focus and more effective application of intersectionality. This call has been made in response to frameworks that have often approached prevention work with little consideration or acknowledgement of how structural inequalities interact with masculinity to produce different patterns of violence. Research shows the likelihood of men using violence is often shaped by other factors, such as poverty and social marginalization. Reports on masculinity and violence find that as well as influencing women's ability or willingness to seek assistance or support in the event of violence, various forms of oppression and hardship also influence men's perpetration of violence. Research has found that masculinity intersects with other aspects of men's identity and experience to help shape their attitudes and practices relating to women and violence. Scholars explain that men's violence supportive attitudes and behaviors are definitely shaped by gender, but gender also intersects and interacts with other forms of structural inequality based on class, race, and ethnicity. Just to give an example, because it's a very complex subject. Research accounts of violence highlight culture as the primary driver of this violence. However, this wrongly diverts attention away from the key role of gender. This focus on the culture of these communities also makes invisible the violence that emerges from dominant culture, which is violence perpetrated by white, wealthy men, and ignores the ways in which structures of power, which marginalize some men, also drive this violence. In relation to immigrant and refugee men, racism and other forms of discrimination that are embedded in structures and institutions help to shape their masculinities and hence their attitudes and practices towards women. Further to this, research has noted that experiences of resettlement can contribute to the perpetration of violence by refugee men against their female partners due to increased social isolation, trauma, and feelings of cultural alienation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Ms. Fajiri. In the first panel, as you know, we discussed how harmful gender stereotypes can contribute to violence against women. Now, I ask you, Mr. Brian Farrugia, and also Professor Marceline Naudi, what are other related, if there are, stereotypes or contributing factors found to put certain women at even higher risk of victimization than others?
Thank you. Yes, whenever a victim reaches our offices, we do carry out a victim's assessment. And automatically, this applies that we carry out an intersectional approach. Eventually, such an assessment brings us to light various circumstances which affect the life of the victim and its family. Just to give you an example of how two similar persons within the same category of crime can actually vary in different risks, I give you the example of two women aged 45 years old, and both are victims of violence or abuse. One is married with a steady job and no kids, already filed a police report. And the other one is married with 2 kids and has never been in employment. Depending on her husband, she is very hesitant to file a police report. So here we have the two same criminal offenses, but with different intersectional circumstances. Let's say that there are different identities and there are different characteristics. So in such a case, it is essential for our team to ignore stereotyping at this stage and focus on intersectionality. We should take into account the reason why a victim is reacting differently, what are their fears, their actual fears, how they are perceiving their future, what is the impact of crime on their loved ones and their social well-being, and eventually, how can they be protected.
Thank you. I call Professor Naudi.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There are various other stereotypes in our society, of course, that we absorb by virtue of living, of having been brought up and living and continuing to live within our society. In class, I use this sound, so be ready. I use this sound and I go, we absorb by virtue of being where we are, of being within our society, we absorb certain gender and other stereotypes. So, for example, people of a different culture, I have heard people say things like, you know, there are certain cultures, those people, like, it's normal for them, you know? Like violence is like normal for them, right? So we don't take it as seriously. So, for example, there's certain ideas about the Muslim culture. You know, people, a Muslim woman coming to report violence may not be taken as seriously because, like, you know, for them, those people, it's like normal for them, right? A gay man coming to report violence may not be taken seriously because people might say, well, you know, it's just two men having a fight. Like, you know, what's the fuss? A lesbian woman coming to report violence might not really be taken seriously because, I mean, like, you know, women aren't violent. You know, like, I mean, how much violence could you have received, you know, from your intimate partner? So we have certain stereotypes, certain ideas that we have absorbed by virtue of living here. And when I say we, I mean me, I mean you, all, and I mean the people who work in the field, whether they work as police officers, or as lawyers, or as judiciary, or as social workers, or as in the health field. So they may not take they will tend to operate on the stereotypes that we have absorbed simply because in our society we very rarely get the opportunity to stop and think, to pull apart these stereotypes. So when we talk about education, which we heard a lot about in the previous panel, which is of course very, very important, we must not only look at gender, we have to look at gender. Hey, this is Marceline speaking. We absolutely have to speak about gender. However, we also have to look at all the other stereotypes that our society promulgates and that we absorb by virtue of living here, and that therefore we live our lives, our perspective, and we do our jobs, sadly, through this sieve, if you like, of stereotypes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, in terms of, I call you, Mr. Brian Farouk, in terms of victims seeking support, what are the main barriers faced by these victims in seeking support?
In our line of work, victims who have experienced victimization is ongoing. So what I mean here is that the majority of victimization is caused by the crime per se, but also there are other elements which we call secondary victimization. These are all barriers that are referred to victims. Well, just to put it in the picture, every victim suffers from a trauma. So the first point of reference is to combat the traumatic effect of any crime. But then it happens also that they are not familiar with the procedures. Most of victims feel alone. Most of victims feel that they don't know how to proceed in order to access justice, in order to access support. So these are all barriers that victims of crime face. Well, it is our duty, and this is our call as well, to treat victims with dignity and respect, to put more efforts at the law courts, especially during counter-examinations, to treat victims with more sensitivity also, and making the judiciary aware also that they have suffered from a criminal offense. Also, we shall continue to strive for the setup of multi-agency approach amongst us, all those professionals who work in the field of victim support, to facilitate access to victim services. Victims of crime have their rights, and it's our job to ensure that victims are well informed, provided with support services free of charge and in a confidential manner, and above all, assist them to regain their former quality of life. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brian. Now I call Dr. Clea Tsoppardele, and the question is, taking disability as one particular example, which are the specific obstacles which women and girls with disability face, and what can be done to overcome them?
I'd say that the obstacles faced by persons with disability are attitudinal, physical, financial, and also institutional. We heard very recently a question that was set to somebody who reported physical assault about what she was wearing. I wonder what would be asked to a woman with disability. Definitely they are doubted for what happened, about the experience that happened to them. They are doubted as to whether they recognize the situation they were in and whether they are really aware of things. They are also, as I mentioned before, our justice system, rather than them, is still not equipped to meet the needs of persons with disability. So these obstacles, these institutional obstacles, together with financial ones, with physical ones, but mostly with attitudinal ones, are the obstacles we need to overcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Clea Tsoppardele. Now I call again Professor Naudi. And the question, two questions are the following. How does the notion of privilege come in, and how does it vary, if at all, between men and women? And the second question is, are there, for example, forms of privilege that are commonly identified as protective factors for women but not for men? Professor Naudi.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To tell the truth, when I was sent this question, it sort of confused me a bit, and I thought, huh? What do they want? What do they want to come out with this question? But of course, I can speak to it. I can speak to it. So, if we're talking about intersectionality, which we are, then clearly, if we look at women, some women are further disadvantaged than other women. If you look at it the other way around, you can say that some women are privileged as compared to other women because their disadvantage is slightly less than the disadvantage of the others, right? So that is one way of looking at it and considering, privilege. We know that in a patriarchal society, most women are disadvantaged and some men are disadvantaged. We know that some things that act as symbols of, not only symbols, but actually give access to power in men, might not necessarily do so for women. So, for example, if a woman is a victim of a spouse or partner who is in a very powerful position in society, then it is even more difficult, not easier, it is actually even more difficult for that woman to report and to get out of that situation. So something which gives privilege to men in that situation actually further disadvantages a woman. On the other hand, yes, of course, if a woman has her own resources, her own access to financial and other material, not only material, but even other resources, for example, a strong support network, okay, as well as resources. So when you teach about violence against women, you often get people in class speaking to you afterwards and telling you, hey, me. I remember a particular student who told me that she was a victim of intimate partner abuse, but they had a summer residence in, I don't know, a B, and she left the marital home and she went to the summer residence because she had that option, because she had that material resource, which other women may well not actually have. So, and she was also employed. She also had financial means of subsistence. So there are different kinds of privilege, or less disadvantage, or, further disadvantaged, or whatever, which exists, obviously, amongst women, between women and men, because patriarchy generally. So, notwithstanding that some women are less disadvantaged than other women, if we look at, for example, social class, just to give an example, if we look at women and men of the same social class, those women are disadvantaged compared to the men. If we look at people with disabilities, same disability, men and female, the woman is likely to be more disadvantaged. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Naudi. Now I have a question for Mr. Maki Camilleri, and the question is, what has been the impact of social media on intersectional discriminations?
As we are all aware, social media is the latest trend for marketing, awareness raising, advertising, and especially in certain age groups. Nowadays, many people use social media as their main means of getting information, accessing news, showing what they want, their views, and also interacting and connecting to the world. Social media became a way of life and a way of how people express themselves. Media houses realized this matter and changed from the printed version, and every media house is now operating on social media. It's very easy to access, it's cheaper, and you can reach a much wider audience than you can do from the printed version. Similar to other topics, there are the positive aspects and the negative aspects. For example, as the Human Rights Directorate, through a measure from the Gender Equality Mainstreaming Strategy, we launched a campaign this year targeting intersectionality and intersectional approach as an awareness raising. And there are many other local organizations and international organizations doing certain promotions on equality, including the intersectional approach. However, there are also other influencers, which we saw a booming of individual people posting their stories and their views, giving, as it was already mentioned in the previous panel, toxic messages, messages against the great achievements we reached in equality, trying to make fun of certain identities and certain characteristics. And somehow the positive message, when we dedicate a lot of time in developing a good video, good content, we also spend funds in boosting so it reaches a wider view. A video which is taken with no cost by somebody, and it has a negative effect, let's say the toxic effect, it goes viral. There's a tendency that people prefer to watch clips with a certain aspect. So same goes for media houses and articles. It is important that sometimes, even through a wrong title in a message, people tend to just read the title, and then you start seeing a lot of comments, hatred comments. Sometimes they don't even reflect the content of the article. From the Human Rights Directorate, we just introduced an LGBTIQ media guidelines to help media people in such thing. And also we are developing an anti-racism media guidelines. Social media is a very important tool. It has to be used wisely. in order to push forward the positive messages and ideally remove or eradicate the negative ones which can contribute to violence and online violence. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Michael Camilleri, and then thank you all to the second panel for this very interesting insight. Now, to conclude this panel, I would like to ask one final question to each and every one of you in the panel. And the question is, what actions can be taken to prevent and address multiple discriminations, and how can men and boys be involved? And I start with Audrey Frigieri.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As we have all agreed this morning, because we have referred to education at various instances, and indeed education is key, we all know that. But concretely, what can we do? You know, when we speak to educators, they tell us the curriculum is full, there are examinations, you know, everything is rigid and major changes would have to be done to introduce a human rights-based education, for example, which is necessary. And what we have done with Safe Dates, for example, which has taken a lot of work to include on the PSCD curriculum. So yes, that is definitely a good way forward. But on a deeper level, we must involve education in such a way as to analyze our priorities. So currently, it seems that the work in education is geared into equipping, training, forming our young people to contribute to the economy, which is good in itself. We need a strong economy. But before we can be effective professionals, effective workers in our job, in our work, in our careers, first of all, we are human beings. Our well-being is essential. You know, we cannot function if we do not feel well, if we do not feel healthy, if we do not feel loved and worthy of love. These are so-called soft skills, which are really the hard core of everything. So, for me, if you ask me, that is how I see the way forward, which is redirecting our priorities back to the human being. Start from our well-being, our health, our safety, our values with regard to each other, how we respect each other and value our diversity, you know? And then everything will follow. It will make us more effective workers, better colleagues, stronger, more resilient. And most of all, we would do away with this violence, this abuse that permeates our society, unfortunately. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Audrey. I call now Brian Farrugia.
Well, definitely from our end, it is a must that we continue to promote victims' rights at all levels and to all genders, and also to facilitate access to victim support services. We shall continue to adopt this intersectional approach in a way that we study in a holistic manner the circumstances surrounding the victims, and most importantly is that we keep on working together through a multi-agency and a multidisciplinary approach to safeguard the interest of the victims of crime. That is the utmost that we can do at this stage in time to protect, safeguard and assist victims of crime. Thank you.
Thank you. I call now Claire Lane.
My colleague Alex spoke about cultural change, and I do think it's a mentality change we require. And my colleague Audrey here spoke of education. Yes, we have to normalize sex education, normalizing it by being proactive and not reactive. And social media has been spoken about a lot. I work a lot with educators who report back about their experiences in school and the students' access to social media and content, not just social media. We mentioned video games, we mentioned pornography, content that is not that is not doing them any good. So we need to be proactive in addressing these educational needs. And when we're strategizing, we need to be inclusive. I can mention good practice, for example, in the awareness campaigns that were produced by the Commission of Gender-Based Violence and Domestic Violence, which were representative, included persons with disability, included identities, we're speaking about intersectionality here, included gender, included race, included disabilities. So undoing these stereotypes that these experiences happen only to certain kinds of people.
Thank you. I call now again Mr. Michael Camilleri.
Not to repeat on what my colleague said, which I agree on all the aspects, I think to add on, the most important thing is to learn and celebrate diversity. We are all different, all of us. No one is like the other, not even twins. And we must learn that it is a celebration, it's something good that people are different, that they come from different backgrounds, different knowledge, different education, and all the other effects.
Thank you. And finally, Professor Marcel Naoudi.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And again, I do not want to repeat everything that my colleagues have said, and which I agree with fully. So I will just build on that, just to point out that discrimination which exists within our society and people who discriminate against others, very often it's not done because, as I also often use the phrase, it's not done because those people are horrible, mean and nasty. It's done out of ignorance, it's done out of lack of knowledge, it's also done maybe out of fear. Change is always difficult. It is much easier to stay in stasis, in the same situation that you are in, rather than move to change. Our society does treat us differently, not only as women and men, but also according to all of the other things that we have been mentioning here. And some of us, women and men, have greater access to the things that society considers valuable, whether that is health and well-being and money and stuff. But I always believed, I was brought up to believe, and I have assimilated that those of us who are more advantaged, those of us who have been given, who have received more opportunities, with that comes a responsibility. With that comes a responsibility to work to decrease the gap between, if you like, the haves and the have-nots. And I think that that is very, very important, because each and every one of us here, and each and every one of people who are listening, wherever they are listening from, we can create change. We can do our little bit to create change, and that is how society changes. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Marcel Naoudi, for your remarks. And now, if I ask if any from the floor have any questions to the panel. Yes, the gentleman, your name and ask the question.
Hello, this is Daniel.
Stand up, please.
Hello. This is Daniel. I'm from the Times of Malta. I have a question for Mr. Brian Farrugia. You mentioned a very interesting point where you said, where you talked about third country nationals. You said a third country national would have a lot of different issues when you were talking about intersectionality to report and so on. And you used the domestic issue. Another issue is that a third country national who loses their job, I'm sure you know, has 10 days to find another job before they have to leave the country. If this person is being sexually harassed, whatever, at work, what can they do?
Okay, yes, yeah, Brian Farrugia.
Thank you. Basically, what we're saying here is sometimes through our intersectional approach as well, there's a tendency that most third country nationals fear the law enforcement authorities because in their hometown, they are seen as brutal, or actually they are brutal. So they fear to report. So when they come to our end, we try to assist them as much as possible to give them information on the current realities in Malta. Now, when it comes to employment, that's something else. But if somebody is abused and is seeking our support, he won't get deported. So we hadn't that issues because we just need to proceed as a normal violation. So I must point out that fact. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If there are other questions, if there aren't, that concludes the second panel. So I thank you once again for the excellent panel, for the valuable contributions. And now that we have reached the end of our conference, I would like to invite now the Honourable Minister Ian Borge, Minister for Foreign and European Affairs and Trade, to present his concluding remarks. Minister.
Thank you, Honourable Mr. Speaker, Excellencies, dear colleagues, distinguished participants. At the outset, I would like to first and foremost thank the Honourable Speaker for hosting us here at the Parliament building and for moderating the sessions. Thanks also goes to the keynote speakers and the panelists for their interesting and expert insights, which surely contributed to a vibrant discussion on this important topic. As already mentioned by our panelists here today, violence against women remains a pervasive human rights violation worldwide, not least in Malta, which needs our immediate and focused attention. It can happen anywhere and to all women. It happens at schools, places of work, even and regrettably most often in one's own home. All places where women should feel safe and secure. It happens to any kind of women. In fact, on a global level, around 1 in every 3 women aged 15 years and over has experienced violence at least once in her lifetime. But as we have heard, some women experience it to a harsher extent and are more prone to victimization and re-victimization due to their personal circumstances and other inequalities they face. It is a silent assault which too often remains hidden behind closed doors and not reported due to fear for the victim's safety or that of their children, fear of victim blaming, financial dependence on the perpetrator, stigma or self-blame, among other reasons. It is our duty to ensure that all members of society, including women and girls, feel secure and empowered. There cannot be a safe society if some of its members feel threatened. We need to stand together and unite our efforts to fight at all levels and work towards preventing it from happening in the first place. But to do so, men and boys need to actively engage in this mission, hence the theme of today's conference. As rightly stated in the Istanbul Convention, which Malta had proudly signed and ratified early on, men and boys can be key allies in the fight against violence against women. Testimony to this is the valuable work which is being done by NGOs, such as Men Against Violence, to which we have heard firsthand the experiences and initiatives of this very same NGO in engaging directly with men to raise awareness on this matter. Such actions are indeed commendable. However, it cannot be just an initiative of the few. These attitudes need to be ingrained in the society's mentality, and for that to happen, we need to address and eliminate harmful gender stereotypes. As we have heard, the normalization of violence as an expression of masculinity has harmed not only women, but also men themselves, and feeling that they need to repress their emotions to avoid appearing vulnerable, negatively impacting their mental health. This harmful masculinity idea is often a stumbling block for men who are against violence but are too afraid to speak out and stand up, as they believe they would be perceived as not men enough. Our speakers today have delved into great detail on how to deal with such persistent challenges. I would like to highlight one in particular, the importance of education, especially from a young age, in actively promoting gender equality and challenging harmful stereotypes. Distinguished participants, violence against women is a scourge that no country is immune to, including our own. Engaging men and boys is a necessary step. However, it is only one part of the equation. A whole of society approach will not be effective if the right approaches to policy are not in place. A successful approach to tackling violence against women has to take into consideration the interplay of the various intersectional elements such as ethnic origin, race, age, sexual orientation, and disabilities, among others. No victim faces the same threats, hence such factors cannot be brushed aside. In this regard, an intersectional approach is crucial in addressing violence against women. Aware of this, Malta addresses intersectionality in its laws on gender-based violence and domestic violence. Malta has also taken several steps in addressing violence against women in a holistic manner through the collaboration with specialist services such as NGOs working with refugees and migrants, and services for persons with disability and the elderly, among others. We have and continue to proudly promote the Istanbul Convention, which remains the most comprehensive international treaty to tackle this gendered violence, and which we strongly hope many more countries will ratify. Although we have progressed a lot as a country in terms of gender equality and the empowerment of women, including in promoting increased participation even in politics and the recognition of femicide as an aggravated crime, there's still so much more to be done. We are determined to continue to build on the progress made and spearhead further reforms to enable the whole society to reach its full potential. We hope that this conference has served as an opportunity to further exchange views and reflect on possible ways forward in combating violence against women more effectively and in a holistic manner. There are no and will never be any excuses to tolerate or even worse, condone violence against women, and we all need to work hand in hand to find this heinous violation of human rights. Therefore, in conclusion, I call all men to join me in championing this cause alongside women. Let's speak out and stand up in stopping violence against women. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister, Honourable Mr. Burch. Now I call the permanent representative of Malta to the Council of Europe, His Excellency Lawrence Ovella, to present his remarks.
Honourable Speaker, Honourable Minister, Members of Parliament, Excellencies, dear colleagues, distinguished participants. Let me start by echoing what Minister Burch has just said and thank the Honourable Speaker for hosting this event today and for moderating the two very interesting sessions we've heard. I would also like to personally thank Minister Burch and Permanent Secretary Kotayar for their support and trust in us in organising such an important event today. I would also like to thank the keynote speakers, panelists, and all the participants for making this conference so interesting today. It goes without saying that I also must thank my deputy, Dr. Francesca Camilleri Vettiger, and Ms. Leonia Aquilina and Antonella Bayada from the Ministry for European and Foreign Affairs and Trade for taking care of all the details for this event and for actually making it possible for us to hold these discussions today. As we heard throughout the conference, the Istanbul Convention is one of the most important international treaties established by the Council of Europe. It is a comprehensive legal framework that sets out the obligations of governments to prevent violence, protect victims, and prosecute perpetrators. It is today considered to be the golden standard when it comes to combating violence against women worldwide. The Convention is a critical tool in the fight against violence against women, which is, as we heard, a pervasive and persistent problem in societies around the world. Every year, millions of women and girls suffer from physical, sexual, and psychological violence, which can have devastating and long-lasting effects on their life. However, as we've heard throughout this whole morning, the Convention alone is not enough. It is essential to engage boys and men in the fight against violence against women. We need to work together as a society to challenge harmful gender norms and stereotypes that perpetuate violence and promote healthy and respectful relationships between men and women. Boys and men can play a vital role in this process. By rejecting harmful masculinity and embracing positive masculine traits such as empathy, respect, and kindness, we can help to create a culture of respect and equality. We can be powerful allies in the fight against violence, speaking out against it, and supporting women who are victims of violence. It's not just about standing up for women. It's also about standing up for ourselves as men. Harmful masculinity harms men as well, creating unrealistic expectations and pressures that can lead to mental health problems and other issues. So what can boys and men do to help? We can start by listening to women and learning about their experiences. We must challenge sexist attitudes and languages, and we must call out abusive behavior when we see it. We must bear responsibility. We as men have a responsibility to teach each other. As men, we have the responsibility to center and frame this conversation back to where it belongs, on us, because this is our responsibility. The burden for women to stay safe must not fall on women themselves. Rather, it is imperative that men change their behavior, as this burden lies on us. The solution to violence against women does not stand with women. On the other hand, it stands with us men. Whether we like it or not, as we've heard today, in most cases, the violence is perpetrated by men. So we have the responsibility to be at the center of this debate. That is why it is of the utmost importance that men and boys support organizations and initiatives that work to prevent violence against women. As we have heard and seen here today, the Istanbul Convention is a critical tool in the fight against violence against women. But it's not enough on its own. We need to engage boys and men in the fight, promoting healthy and respectful relationships. By working together, we can create a safer and more equal world for everyone. In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, allow me to just mention the importance of the Council of Europe, and in particular the Deputy Secretary General, Mr. Björn Berg, for setting up the Council of Europe Days, telling the Council of Europe story, which this event is part of, which is a project aimed at encouraging member states to play a more leading role in raising the profile of the Council of Europe at a national level. We do hope that this event will be one of many where we can highlight the impact that the Council of Europe has had and still has on our daily lives and that of citizens. Today, people across the Council of Europe, 46 member states of the Council of Europe, live in greater safety, security, and dignity because our governments protect their human rights across the continent. However, most of us would indeed struggle to list all our rights as laid out in the European Convention on Human Rights. And we might also not be aware of the various conventions that we have in place, covering everything from the prevention of torture to tackling human trafficking to, indeed, the Istanbul Convention. In fact, we all benefit from our rights throughout our lives and in everything we do, from our education, healthcare, and housing to how we express our opinions, participate in society, and spend our free time. By holding these events across our member states, we can let people know about what their rights do for them and help them further empower themselves with the knowledge that there is an international organization set up, by the way, exactly on this day in 1949, specifically to hold their government accountable in guaranteeing access to their most fundamental rights. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Vella. And to conclude, first of all, I would like to tell you that it has been an honor to be with you today and, of course, to listen to all the valid points that had been discussed. In spite, of course, all the work and dedication that is put forward to eradicate violence against women, unfortunately, the phenomenon is still a reality. It is our collective responsibility to continue working, as has been said already. We cannot support a culture of silence and impunity. Instead, we must speak publicly. We have to support laws and also policies that, of course, encourage women to come forward when they have been harassed or assaulted, but also make sure that we have to provide the effective remedies for the victims. As you know, in today's reality, we must also ensure that our laws take into account something which was not emphasized, in my opinion, take into account the harm that can be caused by online abuse, where women are still being targeted and harassed. Finally, to conclude, I'd like to go back to the root of today's event about the question that we asked both panels, the role of men and boys. Well, I will compare that to justice. Justice needs to be seen to be done. So men and boys need to be seen to fight violence against women. So let us all work together and be each other's allies in order to gain equality for all. I thank you, and that concludes the conference. And before we proceed to the foyer, because we have the launch of the photo exhibition, I would like you to come forward for a group photo. Thank you very much. Excellencies, dear colleagues, distinguished participants, so following the very highly insightful discussions we had earlier this morning, I am honored to also open a photo exhibition on the same subject, of course, the subject being on combating violence against women. The photos exhibited were taken by photo artist Mr. Peter Paul Barbara, from whom we will hear the story and message behind each photo. I am very pleased to inform you that the exhibition will stay open until the 11th of May, here at the foyer in Parliament, which is a highly symbolic date, as it is the anniversary of when the Istanbul Convention was opened for the signature 12 years ago on that day. And now I'm giving the floor to my good friend, the EU Commissioner for Equality, Dr. Hena Dalli, also to share a few words. And after that, we hear from the artist himself. Yeah. All right, Pete, give it to you. Please.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm very happy to be here, and especially that I could catch up with Peter. We are all university friends, and he was always one of the prominent photographers in Malta, and I'm very happy that Parliament and Mr. President commissioned Peter to do this work, this very important work. 2 years ago, I also held an exhibition at the Beurre de Mont, and it was called "What Were You Wearing?" And it was the reason for this title and for the content of that exhibition was that many times women who are assaulted or who are raped, they first try to put the blame on the victim, and one of the questions that they ask and is, what are you? And this is not something, which we know from studies or from that, but it is something which is happening, and it happened even this week here when in our law courts we heard a lawyer asking the victim, what were you wearing? And she said, I was wearing leggings, and he said, oh, so they were tight leggings. So I don't know what that means to him, but does wearing tight leggings give you a license to rape me? So raising consciousness, like you are doing, Mr. President, here in the House of Parliament, will help people to think about these realities and contribute to changing the culture. In fact, we always say that we can work on legislation. We have been working on legislation for decades in this area of policy, and still violence against women and domestic violence remain in every society, in every member state, around the world. In fact, United Nations have data which tells us that every hour, 5 women and girls are killed around the world by a member of the family or by an intimate partner. So while we are here today, 5 women around the world are being killed. So we have to go beyond legislation and beyond policy and do what you are doing here, and work on the culture and work on attitudes. And we can never speak enough on what a scourge to our society. And it is not only for women and girls, it is for families, it is for men and for boys, as you were discussing earlier, that we should work harder every day in order to, I never use the word eliminate, because I see it so far away that we come to actually eliminate this scourge, that if I say it, I know that you will laugh at me, because I feel very, very helpless, in spite of being one of the people who works in this area of, or maybe because of that I feel so discouraged. So I'm very, very encouraged when I see artists like you and people in decision-making positions and leaders like you who work on changing the culture and on raising awareness on this terrible scourge. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Speaker, Commissioner. First of all, I would like to thank Ministry of Foreign Affairs for giving me the opportunity to take part in this project. I must say, I didn't prepare a speech. I'm just having some words now. I don't need to really explain the images, because I think they can talk by themselves. However, for me, I think this was a very emotionally charged assignment. I've never done this type of assignment before. My expertise are elsewhere in photography. But for me, working with people who have, in fact, underwent domestic violence, I found it very difficult to find people to take part, even in arranged setups, as these are all arranged setups, but they do depict reality. And the people taking part in them had undergone and suffered domestic violence. So I could really capture the emotions. And I say that it was highly emotional charged assignment because you can see the emotions coming out. I would like to thank my partner, Anna, and her two sons, Damien and Lucian, who participated in this. This is a very small selection of the work we did over the last 4 weeks. It's a very small selection because the space cannot take it, but there are different images showing different kind of violence, even in the street. In a past life, I used to do journalism. I was a journalist in the past, and I have encountered people, mothers being beaten by their sons in the street, and all this experience that I had in my past, I tried to portray it in my work. Even when I was thinking about it, why only women? Because not only, I know this is a subject at the moment, but not only women suffer violence. There are even men who suffer violence. Our elderly suffer violence, who are very 90-year-old, 80-year-old, very fragile, and their sons and their daughters speak to them in a manner which is disgusting. So even that is for me, it's abuse. It's maybe it's time for everyone to come forward. And although in this imagery, it is more easy to portray physical violence because it's a bit difficult to show emotional violence, people talking in a spiteful manner, degrading their partner, their kids, their mother, their father. It's difficult to show it. So that's why the images depict physical violence, unfortunately, because it can be portrayed even more than emotional one. Even myself, I could have done trouble, left consequences on people in my family, partners, past partners, whatever. Even by saying words which you don't mean, and they will leave a negative, how do you say, feeling on them. So it's not just physical abuse. It can be talking, speaking hurtfully, and it's not intentional, but the damage you would do to those people, it's there. So it's not just physical violence. We are portraying physical violence here because it can be depicted more. I think that's it. Thank you.